Kairen woke up to the cold and the smell of rotten straw. He was lying on the floor of the town hall in Aspern. Above him loomed the ceiling with its peeling murals. Clutched in his hand was a piece of paper bearing a black wax seal. His head was throbbing. Someone else's memories were slowly falling into place. This body belonged to a vagabond named Kairen Vale. 3 days ago, the vagabond had won the right to govern Aspern in a game of dice against a drunken steward. The steward had roared with laughter as he bet the city. Now Kairen understood why. He stood up and walked to the window. Below lay the city, gray rooftops, an empty market square, a line at the debt office stretching 2 blocks long. The people in line stood silently, staring at the ground. A translucent table flashed before Kairen's eyes. The equal exchange system welcomed its new owner. The essence was laid out in 3 lines. The governor had the right to pay off any resident's debt from the city treasury. In return, the debtor voluntarily surrendered a portion of their talent, luck, or term of service. The exchange was always of equal value and could not be enforced by force. Kairen reread the lines twice. His fingers reached out on their own toward the sealed document. Somewhere in the depths of his memory, a skill from another life stirred. He could read ledgers faster than others read prayers. He didn't stop to wonder where that skill came from. He simply went to look for the ledgers. The town hall's archive occupied the basement. The ledgers were stacked from floor to ceiling. Kairen lit a lamp and opened the top one. An hour later, his hands were trembling, not from fear, but from anger. The residents of Aspern owed 7 noble houses a total of 400,000 gold crowns. The entire city's annual income was 11,000. The interest was growing faster than the payments. Children inherited their father's debts. Grandchildren inherited their grandfather's interest. The city wasn't thriving. The city was servicing someone else's entries in someone else's ledger. Yet the governor's treasury wasn't empty. In a separate chest lay 9,000 crowns for entertainment expenses. Previous governors had spent them on wine. Kairen closed the book and smiled for the first time that day. He knew what to do with the money that everyone considered small change. In the morning, he went out into the city without a guard and without his coat of arms. There was a commotion at the bakery. 2 bailiffs in Baron Kroger's colors were dragging the baker out onto the street. The baker was broad-shouldered and graying. He offered no resistance. He only asked to be allowed to finish baking the morning batch because it had already been paid for. The senior bailiff replied that a debt of 60 crowns was more important than bread and that they would seize the oven to cover the interest. The crowd watched in silence. Kairen stepped forward and identified himself as the governor. The bailiff eyed his tattered cloak and laughed. He said that governors in Aspern changed more often than the weather, and that the baron couldn't care less about pieces of paper with a seal on them. Kairen asked for the total amount of the debt. The bailiff named the sum of 62 crowns, including the morning's interest. Kairen counted out the money from his purse right onto the barrel. The crowd held its breath. The bailiff recounted the coins 3 times. Then he took them and left without saying a word. The baker looked at Kairen as if he were a figure from a legend. The system's table unfolded before Kairen's eyes. The baker Matis's debt was paid off. The debtor proposes an exchange. Options available: 1/3 of a talent for working with dough, 5 years of service, a share of physical endurance. Kairen chose endurance and a small share of talent. The vagabond's body was weak, and that needed to be corrected. Warmth washed over his muscles. His shoulders straightened of their own accord. Matis gasped and said he felt as if he'd given up a part of himself, yet lost nothing in the process. Kairen replied that this was exactly how an honest exchange worked. He asked the baker for one thing: to tell the neighbors that the governor didn't pay off debts out of charity. The governor was buying the city's future piece by piece. By evening, 11 people were standing outside City Hall. Chiron received them one by one. The shoemaker traded his dexterity for a debt of 40 crowns. The laundress traded 2 years of service at City Hall for a debt of 30. The old clerk traded his talent for arithmetic for a debt of 80. The clerk's talent layered over Chiron's own skill, and they fit together like two halves of a key. Now he could spot errors in the records before he had even finished reading a line. In his past life, such speed in checking records had earned him the nickname the Audit Beast. The thought flashed through his mind and faded. The past mattered only where it was useful. By the end of the third day, the treasury was down by 900 crowns. In return, Chiron gained the stamina of a hammerer, the hands of a jeweler, a gift for arithmetic, and 9 employees who looked to him as their savior. City Hall came alive. The floors were scrubbed clean. The archives were sorted through. In the square in front of City Hall, Chiron ordered a board to be set up on which the total amount of debt paid off the previous day would be written each morning. The number on the board became the town's top news story. People came just to look at it. On the 5th day, a guest arrived at City Hall. Baron Kroger's tax collector was dressed in velvet and contempt. His name was Ulmer. He walked into the office without knocking and sat down without being invited. He said that ridiculous rumors had reached the Baron that a penniless governor was buying up the debts of the common people. He said that in his line of duty he had seen 4 governors, and they had all met the same end. 1 drank himself to death, 2 fled, the last one gambled away his fortune. He glanced at Chiron's patched cloak and added that the 5th would likely meet his end sooner than the rest. Chiron silently placed a sheet of paper before him. It was a list of debts settled over the past 5 days, complete with signatures and amounts. 41 people, 1,300 crowns. Each entry was certified according to the Baron's Chancellery's format, without a single error. Ulmer scanned the list and was about to smile. Then he read it again, slowly. His fingers clenched the sheet a little tighter than they should have. For 20 years he had searched for errors in Aspern's papers and had always found them. There was nothing to look for here. He looked up and, for the first time, saw Chiron as a person rather than a blank space. He asked who had kept the records. Chiron replied that he had kept them himself. Ulmer was silent for a moment. Then he said he would relay everything to the Baron exactly as it was. At the door, he turned around and said quietly, without a trace of mockery, "The Baron doesn't like cities that pay off their debts. The Baron lives off those debts." The door closed. Chiron was left alone and opened the debt ledger to the page for the Kroger household. The Baron owned 1/3 of all of Aspern's Iowas, 130,000 crowns. As Chiron paid off the debts bit by bit, the Baron was losing out bit by bit. The Baron wouldn't put up with this for long. That evening, the system displayed a summary. 1,300 crowns in debt were paid off. 8 talents and 26 years of service were received. 7,700 remained in the treasury. Chiron looked at the numbers and realized a simple truth. The treasury would last for another month of such debt buybacks. Then the money would run out, and 398,000 in debt would remain. Paying off debts from the treasury was like trying to empty the sea with a spoon. The city didn't need spending, the city needed revenue. The city needed someone who knew how to turn copper into silver. On the morning of the 6th day, a laundress from among his new servants brought news along with the clean laundry. She said that in 3 days a debt auction would be held in Aspern. The nobles sell hopeless debtors to one another like livestock. The highlight of the auction was announced to be the merchant Morel, the very same woman who, 5 years ago, ran shops in 3 cities. The very same woman whose caravan sank along with all her merchandise. Her debt is so great that she's being put up for auction in her entirety, along with the right to a lifetime of service to the buyer. The laundress added in a whisper that, before her ruin, this woman had doubled her own father's turnover in a single season. Chiron closed the debt ledger. He asked where the auction was being held and how much a seat in the hall cost. The laundress replied that it was in the guild hall and that admission is free for nobles, while others must pay a deposit of 100 crowns. Chiron counted out 100 crowns and set them aside in his purse. He didn't yet know how much they would ask for the merchant's debt. He knew something else, though. In his past life, he had bought failing businesses for their debts and pulled them back from the brink. A failed caravan is a loss. A mine that doubled turnover in a single season is capital. The nobles in the guild hall would be buying the debtor. He would come to buy the future financial capital. The guild hall smelled of wax and perfumed wigs. Chiron posted a deposit of 100 crowns and took a seat in the back row. People were glancing at him. He'd bought a new cloak, but everyone here already knew the face of the governor from the commoners. The nobles were whispering and snickering. An auctioneer named Hess stepped onto the platform at exactly noon. The first lot up for auction was a blacksmith with a debt of krone. A fat knight bought him for 140. The second lot was a family of coal miners. They were divided between two buyers, and the mother was led away from her son through two different doors. The hall didn't notice this. The hall was waiting for the main event. Mireille was led out without chains. Her chains were replaced by a piece of paper that Hess held aloft. A debt of 9,400 crowns owed to 4 creditors. A lifetime of service to whoever buys the entire lot. Chiron looked at the woman on the platform. She was about 30. Her dress was mended but clean. Her back was straight. She surveyed the hall calmly and intently, and Chiron recognized that gaze. That's not how victims look at a crowd. That's how appraisers look. She was assessing the wealth of everyone who had come to buy her. Hess started at 3,000. Baron Felder raised it to 3.5 and shouted that he'd put her to work counting his granaries. The hall burst into laughter. Room, a first guild merchant, raised the bid to 400. The gray-haired Count Ilvis objected and offered 5. Chiron remained silent. He waited, recalling a line from her case file, which he had bought yesterday from a guild clerk for 10 crowns. The Mireille caravan had not sunk in a storm. The caravan set sail on the very day the insurance company refused to issue her a policy. The refusal was signed by one of Baron Felder's men. This was no bad luck. It was the port authorities' deliberate sabotage of the business. The bidding reached 6,000, and Room and Ilvis were the only two left. At 7,000, the Count waved his hand and sat down. Guess raised the gavel and scanned the room. Chiron stood up and named a figure. 9,400. The full amount of the debt, no haggling. Silence fell over the room like snow. No one who could do the math would pay face value for a hopeless debtor. Guess asked for confirmation. Chiron repeated the figure and added that he would pay in gold today. Room burst out laughing and shouted that the penniless governor had gone mad and that he didn't have that kind of money. Chiron stepped up to the platform and took the treasury bags out of the steward's chest. 7,700 city crowns and 1,700 from the sale of the governor's ring and the former administrator's carriage. Hess counted for half an hour. Then he struck the gavel. The hall saw Chiron off in silence, while Mireille followed behind him, staring at the back of his head as if it were a mystery. Once outside the guild doors, she spoke first. She said she had to warn the new owner. She said she had tried to flee her creditors 4 times and had almost succeeded twice. Chiron replied that she wouldn't have to flee because in a minute she would be debt-free. He activated the system right there on the steps. Mireille's debt has been fully repaid. The debtor proposes an exchange. Options available: full bargaining talent, 10 years of service, half bargaining talent, and 5 years of voluntary partnership. Chiron chose the third option. Mireille staggered and grabbed the railing. She looked at her hands as if they had become lighter. Then she looked at Chiron and asked why he had left her half her talent when he could have taken it all. Chiron replied that he doesn't buy horses, he buys riders. Half of her intuition in his head, plus Mireille herself at the helm of his business, are worth more than all the talent in his head and an empty-headed woman by his side. She was silent for a long time. Then she laughed for the first time in 5 years and said that this was the first time she'd seen a man who paid face value and still came out ahead. Someone else's intuition had taken root in Chiron by evening. He walked through the market, seeing prices not with his eyes, but with his gut. Salt in Aspern cost 3 times as much as at the port 3 days' journey away. Wool was being sold to middlemen for half its true price. Money was leaking out of the city through a dozen holes, and each hole was controlled by some small cabal. Morel walked beside him and named those same holes aloud before he could even open his mouth. They exchanged a glance and understood each other without words. They set up headquarters in the town hall. Morel demanded 3 things: a warehouse yard, 20 reliable workers, and the right to conclude deals using the governor's seal. Chiron granted everything and added a 4th condition. He showed her the city's debt ledger and asked what she saw. Morel leafed through it for an hour. Then she said quietly that she didn't see a debt book. She saw a book of prices at which the nobles had bought up the entire city, and that if the city started making money, those same IOUs could be bought back for 1/3 of their face value because the nobles had long since stopped believing in their full value. Chiron nodded. For the first time since waking up, he heard his own plan spoken by someone else. They pulled off the first deal within a week. Using the money from the service of 20 debtors, they equipped 4 carts to haul salt to the port. The salt was delivered and sold for 1/3 less than the middlemen's prices. The line stretched all the way to the city gates. The middlemen howled and slashed their prices, and Chiron immediately bought up their stocks at a bargain price through a frontman, a shoemaker. The second batch of salt was sold at a higher price, but still cheaper than the old one. The treasury received its first 800 crowns in net profit. A second figure appeared on the board at City Hall next to the number of debts paid off. Earned by the city. They even read it aloud, syllable by syllable. 2 weeks later, the merchant room arrived in Aspern. The very same one who had laughed in the guild hall. He brought a showy caravan and a condescending smile. He asked to be shown the famous warehouse yard because he wanted to have a laugh up close. Morel led him between the rows for an hour. Room looked at the inventory tags on every bale, at the scales calibrated to the standard, at the ledger where every copper coin was accounted for. His smile slipped away slowly, like paint in the rain. At the gate, he took off his hat before Morel, something he'd never done, not even before any of the ruined men. He said that for 20 years he'd considered her a lucky upstart, but now he saw that the sea had taken her ships, but not her wits. He offered Chiron a contract for winter grain deliveries. Chiron signed it and added a clause to the contract stipulating payment via city receipts. Room agreed without looking. Thus, for the first time, Aspern's receipts passed from one stranger's hands to another, just like money. By the end of the month, the courtyard's turnover had reached 6,000 crowns. Chiron paid off the debts of another 47 residents, among whom were 2 carpenters whose talents he had invested in repairing the warehouses, and a healer whose gift he left entirely to her in exchange for her service at the new infirmary. The city was changing before their eyes, and that was precisely why the reply arrived. A messenger bearing the colors of the 7 houses delivered a scroll bearing 7 seals. The district's assembly of nobles notified the governor of the imposition of a customs duty. From now on, every wagon entering or leaving Aspern would be subject to a levy equal to 1/5 of the value of its cargo. In the scroll, this was referred to as maintenance of the roads. Morel read it and turned pale with rage. She said that the tax would kill trade within a month and that the nobles were strangling the city not with a sword but with a seal. Chiron reread the scroll 3 times and, strangely, calmed down. He asked Morel what a merchant does when a road is blocked. She replied that he looks for another route. Chiron shook his head and corrected her. A smart merchant buys out whoever is blocking the way. He unfolded a map of the district and traced his finger along the river that curved around the estates of the 7 houses and ended at an old wharf a day's journey from the city. The wharf belonged to an impoverished knightly family and was mortgaged. Chiron had found it in the debt register on the very first night. The family's debt amounted to 2,000 crowns. The 7 houses' toll did not apply to waterways. Mirel looked at the map, and the anger on her face slowly turned into predatory glee. She said that river transport required barges, a pilot, and security because roving gangs ruled the waters. Chiron was already flipping through the debt ledger. An adventurer named Saphira Kell was awaiting ransom the next day in the city dungeon. The very same woman they sang about in the Three Kingdoms. The very same woman who owed the mercenary guild a penalty for breaching a contract. Her case file stated that she had single-handedly led a caravan through the Pass of the Dead, where 3 armies had been laid to rest. Chiron closed the book and said they would secure guards tomorrow. Aspern's debt pit was a real pit. A round well 3 times a man's height deep, with a grate on top. Chiron arrived there in the morning with Mirel and the warden. The warden grumbled that it would be best not to go down to this prisoner. In the past month, she had knocked out the teeth of 2 guards and broken a third's arm, and all 3 had gone after her themselves. Chiron ordered the grate to be raised and the ladder lowered. Saphira Kell climbed up on her own. She was tall and tanned and moved as if the pit were her own bedroom. A scar ran across her eyebrow. Her hair was cut short with a knife. She looked Chiron up and down, even though she was shorter than him, and asked through the warden who this accountant was and why he smelled of ink. Chiron replied that the accountant had come to buy her debt. Saphira laughed. She said that her penalty to the mercenary guild amounted to 6,000 krone, and that this city, with all its rooftops, didn't have that kind of money. She added that even if the accountant paid, she wouldn't serve a man who held a sword like a spoon. Chiron didn't argue. He placed 2 scrolls on the overseer's desk. The first was a contract with the mercenary guild to buy out the penalty for 4,000, provided payment was made immediately. The guild had knocked off a third because Mirel had haggled with their treasurer for 3 days and driven him to the point of hiccups. The second scroll was an excerpt from Saphira's case file. Chiron read it aloud. The contract to escort the caravan through the Pass of the Dead had been fulfilled. Payment was withheld by the client on the grounds of cargo theft. The accusation was made without an inspection. The client was Baron Felder. Saphira stopped smiling. Chiron continued. The cargo that was allegedly stolen turned up a month later in the warehouses of the Baron's son-in-law. The penalty was pinned on her so that the famous maverick would remain in the pit forever and never reach the crown court. He looked up and said he wasn't offering her a job. He was offering her a debtor. Baron Felder owed her a clear name and 6,000 crowns, and Chiron intended to extract every last coin from the Baron, not with a sword, but with paperwork. He offered her a front-row seat to watch it all unfold and to guard the very thing that was bringing the Baron down. Saphira was silent for a long time. Then she told the warden that she'd changed her mind about breaking the accountant's nose. The system processed the exchange in the prison courtyard. Saphira Kell's debt has been paid off. Options available. Combat proficiency in full. 8 years of service. A share of luck and a sense of danger, plus 3 years of a voluntary security contract. Chiron chose the third option. A warm wave washed over his body, and the world shifted ever so slightly. Now he could feel with his back when someone was watching him. Saphira shrugged and said it was a strange thing. He had less luck, but his heart felt lighter. Apparently, luck hadn't worked in the pit anyway. The pier was bought out that very same day. The impoverished knight Dolph burst into tears when Chiron paid off his family's debt of 2,000 and, in exchange, took not a talent, but 15 years of rights to use the pier and a vow at home. The system counted the oath as service. Chiron began to understand that the system values everything a person gives voluntarily: talent, time, loyalty, and a name. This opened up possibilities he had kept to himself so far, even from Mirel. Work got into full swing. Carpenters who were debtors were putting up awnings at the pier. Mirel chartered 4 barges from the rivermen. Within a week, Saphira had assembled a 100-strong security force, made up of retired soldiers and debtors who had served out their terms. She drove them hard from dawn and called them chicks, but by the end of the week, the chicks were marching in formation and holding their ground against cavalry. Crooked John's rogue band appeared on the water and demanded a tithe from the barges. Sapphira went alone to negotiate. She returned by evening with the entire gang. Crooked Ion followed her and looked at her with the adoring eyes of a subordinate. She explained briefly. She negotiated the tithe directly with Jan himself in a fair deal, and then Chiron paid off the debts of 3 of his men to the port moneylender. Now the band works as pilots. The river was open. The first caravan of 6 barges passed the outposts of the 7 houses along the river and delivered grain and iron without a single krona in duties. The nobles at the checkpoints watched from the shore as money floated past them. The town's monthly turnover reached 20,000. Another 4,000 in debts were paid off. The numbers on the town hall bulletin board grew every morning, and people began coming to Aspern from neighboring villages, some to find work, some to trade. Some just to see the town where debts die. Baron Kroger sent an auditor. The crown auditor was named Maître Odo and wore the chain of the Royal Audit Office. Formally, he was appointed not by the baron but by the district, but everyone knew whose money had paid for the road. Odo was gaunt and old, and famous for having buried 9 governors under sentences over the course of 30 years. He took over the town hall and demanded the ledgers covering the entire period of Chiron's reign. Mirel was nervous. Sapphira suggested drowning the old man in the river and blaming it on the gang. Chiron forbade both. He brought the books to Odo himself, every single one, and sat down across from him. Odo pored over them for 5 days. He was looking for what he always found. Duplicate entries, missing sums, the sale of offices.
On the 6th day, he set down his quill and stared at Chiron for a long time through his spectacles. He said that in 30 years he had seen 2 kinds of governors, thieves who steal cleverly and thieves who steal foolishly. He had come to find out which kind Chiron belonged to. He picked up the last book and said slowly that for the first time he was holding a treasury that was being whittled down to the last copper coin and yet was still growing. He asked only one thing. Why does the governor spend the profits on buying up other people's debts instead of filling the chest? Chiron replied that a chest doesn't earn interest. People do. Odo took off his glasses and wiped them, and Chiron saw something that happens only once in an auditor's lifetime. The old man was smiling. Master Odo's report was sent to the capital with wording the audit office had never used before. No violations. A model of good governance. Baron Kroger received a copy and, according to rumors, smashed his favorite dinner service against the wall. But the real blow came from another direction. A week after the auditor's departure, Sapphira intercepted a courier without a coat of arms on the road. In his bag lay a letter from Baron Felder to Baron Kroger. Chiron read it twice. Felder wrote that the accounting games were lost and it was time to settle the matter the old-fashioned way. That the entire town would gather at the winter fair in Aspern. That a crowd could easily turn into a riot if fed the right words and the right amount of silver. And that not even the crown would investigate the death of a governor killed by his own rabble. Sapphira read over his shoulder and placed her hand on her knife. She said they could be the first to act. Chiron shook his head. A letter without a seal is just a piece of paper. The word of the rabble against 2 barons is nothing. To bring down the nobles, you need their own signatures and witnesses from their circle. We need someone inside their halls, someone who hears what's said behind closed doors. Morel slowly looked up from the ledger. She said she knew just such a person. At the pleasure house next to the guild hall, a woman named Nayla dances. The nobles have been inviting her to all their feasts for 3 years now, and no one holds their tongue around her because everyone consider her a deaf-mute orphan. Morel knew her from her past life and knew 2 things. Nayla hears better than a hunting dog, and her silence isn't due to muteness. She remains silent because her voice is bound. Chiron asked again, Mirel explained that Nayla's debt was held by the owner of the brothel, and the contract bore a witch's seal of silence. As long as the debt remained, she could not utter a single word about what she had heard. The debt amounted to 3,000 crowns, and the owner would never sell it, because the silent dancer with keen hearing was his insurance against the nobles. Chiron locked Felder's letter away in an iron chest. He said the owner would sell it. Everyone in this town owes something. All they had to do was find out who the owner himself owed. The brothel owner's name was Gert, and he wasn't for sale. Chiron had seen that for himself. He came as a guest, ordered some wine, and offered 5,000 for Nayla's debt, which was listed at 3. Gert didn't even bother to count it. He replied that this girl brought him not money but security, and that security wasn't for sale. He smiled like a man backed by all 7 houses at once. Chiron left without arguing. He had no need for an argument. All he needed were 3 days and a talent for numbers. Mirel pulled up the city's trade ledgers. Sapphira shook up the port moneylenders. For 20 crowns, the guild clerk let him look into the mortgage registry. By the end of the 3rd day, Gert's entire life lay on Chiron's table, laid out in numbers. The brothel stood on guild land, and the rent was 2 months overdue. Gert borrowed wine from the merchant room and owed 800 crowns. But the crux of the matter lay deeper. 6 years ago, Gert had built his house with a loan from the temple treasury, using the building itself as collateral, and had paid off almost everything except for the final installment of 400 crowns. He had missed that payment this spring, hoping the temple wouldn't make a fuss. According to the fund's bylaws, defaulting on the final installment gave the temple the right to claim the entire collateral. Everyone except the bylaws themselves had forgotten about this rule. Chiron bought the temple fund's claim for 600 crowns. The abbot was happy to be rid of the contentious document. Then Chiron paid off Gert's debt to Room and bought out the guild's claim on the overdue land lease. The total cost was less than 2,000. On the morning of the 4th day, Gert discovered that his house, his land, and his wine cellar belonged to the governor, and that he himself had to vacate the premises within a week. He ran to City Hall, pale as a sheet. Chiron received him politely and proposed a deal. Gert would get his house back on a 10-year lease at a bargain price, and all his redeemed debts would be forgiven. In exchange, he would sell Nayla's debt for face value and forget about her forever. Gert signed without reading it. Nayla was brought to City Hall that evening. She entered as if stepping onto a stage, silently, her gaze sweeping over everyone at once. She was about 25 years old. She moved in such a way that Sapphira remarked from the doorway that this girl had studied more than just dance. Chiron placed the redeemed contract with the black seal of silence before her and activated the system. Nayla's debt was paid off. The seal of silence was no longer in effect. The debtor proposed an exchange. Options available: dancing talent, 8 years of service, half the gift of hearing and memory, plus 5 years of voluntary service as a secret listener. Chiron chose the 3rd option, and the world exploded with sound. He heard the guards' conversation through 2 walls, the creak of the weather vane on the town hall, Mirel's breathing, which had grown faster. He clenched his teeth and spent half an hour learning to muffle it. Nayla had been watching him the whole time. Then she opened her mouth and spoke for the first time in 6 years. Her voice was low and rusty from silence. She said that for 6 years she had stored every word spoken by the deaf-mute dancer in her memory, and that now she needed a scribe and plenty of paper. She spoke for 3 days. The scribe changed hands 3 times. From her memory, the deals, bribes, and conspiracies of the 7 houses over the past 6 years poured onto the paper. Who had sold a judge's position? Who had forged the land survey records? Who had embezzled the insurance money for Mirel's caravan? On the 3rd day, she got to the main point. A month ago, at a feast at Felder's, she had overheard a conversation between the Baron and a man named Skoll. Felder was paying him to bring 24 rabble-rousers to the winter fair, hand out silver, and lead the crowd to City Hall. Skold took a deposit of 300 crowns and signed a receipt. Nayla remembered even that. The receipt is kept by Felder's treasurer, who doesn't trust the Baron and is gathering documents in case of disgrace. Chiron listened, and a picture of war was taking shape on his desk, not the kind fought with swords, but the kind he knew how to win. In his past life, he had strangled corporations with their own accounting. Here, the accounting wore velvet and coats of arms, but it smelled the same. He divided up the work. Nayla returned to dance at Gert's house, and now every one of her performances before the nobility was turned into an official record. Saphira took Skoll under her wing. She didn't lay a finger on him. She bought out the debts of his 3 loudmouths, and they vanished from the city. As for Skold himself, he found a retired sergeant from the security company at his door, who politely bowed to him every morning. Skold got the hint and fled on his own, returning Felder's deposit out of sheer panic. Mirel set about the main task, the plan that Chiron had been mulling over since that first night in the archives, buying up the nobles' IOs. Aspern's debts to the nobles still totaled 370,000. But the nobles themselves had long since stopped believing that the commoners would pay them back. The promissory notes were being traded among the houses at a discount. The hopeless ones were sold for a quarter of their face value. Through frontmen in 3 cities, Mirel began quietly buying them up. Room took over the capital's market in exchange for a share. The funds came from the court's turnover, which by winter had reached 35,000 a month. Every week, promissory notes with a face value of 10 to 15,000, purchased for 3 or 4, were deposited into an iron chest. The nobles were glad to be rid of the junk. They were selling the rope with which they would be hanged. By the start of winter, what Chiron had been waiting for happened. At Count Ilvis's ball, Nayla overheard a conversation that she transcribed word for word. Treasurer Felder was complaining to a confidant that the Baron had mortgaged his ancestral lands for a war loan and could not pay, and that if someone were to present all his promissory notes at once, the Felder household would collapse within a month. Chiron opened the chest and counted. He had accumulated 41,000 in face value worth of promissory notes from the Felder household. They had been purchased for 11. According to county law, a nobleman's promissory note presented for payment must be settled within 30 days. Otherwise, the debtor forfeits his land to the Crown Court. Mirel looked at the column of numbers and said quietly that they could take everything from Felder as early as tomorrow. Chiron shook his head. Tomorrow is too soon. Felder and Kroger haven't played their hand at the fair yet. Let them play it. A blow against a rebel always looks better than a blow against a neighbor. The winter fair opened on the first day of snow. The city was in a festive mood. Chiron stood on the town hall platform and saw strangers in the crowd, all with the same empty eyes. Skold had fled, but Felder had hired a new organizer. Nayla found out about it 2 days later and named all 23 of them. Saphira knew each one by sight. When the first heckler bellowed about the governor who had sold out the city and hurled a stone at the platform, something strange happened. The crowd didn't join in. The crowd parted. Around each heckler stood 3 men from the guard company in plain clothes. A sergeant caught the stone in midair and politely returned it to its owner, twisting his arm in the process. The people of Aspern stared coldly at the agitators. Mattis the baker stepped forward and asked loudly which of them had paid even a single copper coin toward the city's debts. The crowd laughed, and that laughter quelled the riot, or rather, it turned them to stone. All 23 were taken quietly. Each had a single silver coin of the same mint, and 3 had receipts from Treasurer Felder. The records were drawn up in the presence of witnesses from the guild and Master Odo, whom Chiron had invited to the fair in advance via a letter containing a single phrase: "Come and see an exemplary demonstration." Odo arrived and witnessed the attempted revolt orchestrated by the Baron, documenting every word with the relish of an old hound on the trail. That same evening, Chiron gathered Mirel, Saphira, and Nayla in the town hall. 3 stacks lay on the table. The fair's minutes, Nayla's testimony certified by the temple, receipts from the Felder house for 41,000. Chiron said that in the morning, all of this would be sent off in 2 convoys. The first to the capital, to the audit office and the crown court. The second to Baron Felder, demanding payment within 30 days. Saphira asked what would happen if the Baron sent soldiers instead of paying. Chiron replied that that was exactly what he was counting on. Under the law, an armed refusal to pay turns the debt into a rebellion against the crown court. In that case, it won't be the governor of the commoners who deals with the Felder household. Instead, it will be the duke under whose jurisdiction the barons fall. Nayla looked up from her papers. She said slowly that since the duke had come up in conversation, he should know one thing she'd heard half a year ago but hadn't understood until that very day. Duke Hrothgar himself has been buying up the debts of the district's barons through 2 moneylenders, quietly and for a long time. He's waiting for the barons to rot away so he can take the district for himself. A governor from the commoners who is bringing down the barons before him and using his very own methods will not please the duke at all. The hall fell silent. Chiron looked at the map of the district, where a single large coat of arms was embroidered above the 7 baronial crests. He had thought he was playing against the 7 houses. It turned out that another player had been sitting behind the board all this time. And this player was playing the same game. The convoys set out at dawn. The first carried the records and testimonies to the capital, escorted by 10 of Sapphire's swordsmen. The second carried a demand to Baron Felder for payment of 41,000 within 30 days, as required by county law. Chiron saw them off from the town hall tower and descended to the hall where work, more important than revenge, awaited him. Nayla's words about the duke had changed everything. Against the barons, he had a 3-month head start and their own sins to work with. Against the duke, he had nothing. Hrothgar owned 1/3 of the kingdom's lands, commanded 2,000 lancers, and was a cousin of the crown. Trying to outmaneuver him in the debt buyout was like trying to outbid the sea for a river. Chiron thought about it for 2 days, and on the 3rd, he said something strange to Morel. They're going to stop hiding. Since the Duke will find out about Aspern anyway, Aspern must become a showcase, not a prize. Prey is taken. A showcase is protected. He announced the creation of something that had been brewing in his mind since the first week. The Aspern Exchange House, the district's first bank. Municipal receipts were transformed into standardized promissory notes bearing a seal and anti-counterfeiting measures devised by an elderly engraver who was himself a debtor. Any merchant could deposit gold at Aspern and retrieve it at the port from rooms representative upon presentation of the document. Road robberies had been crippling trade for 100 years. Chiron put an end to road robberies. Deposits were accepted at 3 shares of profit per year. Loans were issued at 8 shares and only for business purposes. Mirel recruited 12 bookkeepers from among the redeemed debtors and drove them as hard as Sapphire drove her 100. Chiron found an heiress for the 4th seat on the board of directors in the same place he found everyone else, in the debt register. The house of Dornhall was the oldest in the district and as poor as a church mouse. The last of the line was named Yvette and lived in the ancestral tower with a single maid and a debt of 22,000 to the ducal treasury. Her father had incurred the debt while trying to raise the family's fortunes through silk mills. The mills burned down. Her father died. The Duke did not demand repayment, and everyone understood why. The Dornhalls held an ancient right to vote in the county assembly, and upon Yvette's death, that right would pass to the creditor. Hrothgar awaited her death as one awaits the ripening of plums. Chiron rode to the tower alone with Nayla. Yvette received them in a cold hall where the only remaining furniture was a table and her pride. She was 20, slender as a feather and as unwavering as a verdict. She listened to the proposal to redeem the debt and replied that in 400 years the Dornhall family had sold neither their vote nor their honor, and that she saw no point in trading the Duke's noose for that of an upstart. Chiron did not argue about honor.
He laid out on the table the documents from her father's textile factory that Morel had obtained from the bankruptcy clerk. Line by line, he showed what his gift for numbers had uncovered. The fires occurred during the very week when the capital's attorney had delayed the insurance payments. After the fires, the attorney bought a house in the capital. His payments came from a money changer who worked for the Duke's treasury. Yvette's father was no failure. Yvette's father was ruined in the same way as Morel. The Duke did not want the debt repaid. The Duke wanted the Dornhall family's vote, and he had been preparing for it for 20 years. Yvette read in silence for a very long time. Her hands did not tremble, and that was more terrifying than tears. Then she asked what exactly the governor wanted in exchange for 22,000. Kairen answered honestly. The system would propose a trade, and the choice would be hers, but he himself was asking for 3 things: the Dornhall family's vote in the county assembly, her knowledge of noble laws and genealogies, which none of his men possessed, and her personal involvement in the management of the exchange house, because a bank run by commoners needed an ancient name on its doors to serve as armor. Yvette stood up and walked over to the tower window. Below lay the lands her family had held for 400 years and lost in a single generation. Without turning around, she said that the Duke had killed her father with paperwork, and that for 4 years she had dreamed of a sword. And now they were offering her a piece of paper sharper than a sword. She turned around and smiled for the first time. The system unfolded in the cold hall. The Dornhall house's debt had been fully repaid. Options are available. The ancestral gift of persuasion in its entirety. 15 years of service. A share of the ancestral gift and knowledge of the laws, plus an alliance between the houses on equal terms. For the second time in his life, Kairen saw an option that no previous deal had ever offered. An alliance on equal terms. The system rated Yvette's willingness higher than anyone else's. He chose the alliance. The seal settled upon them both in a warm ring, and Kairen felt 400 years of district laws fall into place in his mind. Precedents, rights, loopholes. Yvette staggered and laughed, saying she felt as if she'd given away the family library, but remembered every book. The exchange house opened on New Year's Day in the former debt collection office, and Kairen had insisted on that very building. Where the city had once buried its dead, it was now growing. People had been lining up since the night before. In the first month, deposits totaled 60,000. Room put in 20 and brought 3 merchants from the first guild. Aspern's promissory notes were sent along 3 trade routes. Knight Dolph took out his first loan to restore the pier and wept for the second time. A third line appeared on the board at City Hall. The residents of Aspern still owed 290,000. A year ago, it had been 400. Meanwhile, the first convoy arrived. Upon receiving the demand, Baron Felder did exactly what Kairen had predicted. He drove the messengers away with whips and sent 50 soldiers to bring back the insolent governor in chains. The soldiers reached the bridge across the river, where Saphira's guard company and Jan's band were waiting for them on barges armed with crossbows. No battle took place. Saphira stepped forward alone and told the captain of the soldiers 3 things: that the Baron had not paid their wages for the past 4 months, that she knew this for certain because the receipts for the unpaid wages had already been bought up by the exchange house, and that anyone who laid down their weapons could come to Aspern tomorrow, where soldiers were paid on time. The captain thought it over for an hour. By evening, 38 out of 50 had signed up to guard trade caravans. Felder's armed refusal to pay and the attack on the messengers were added as the final entry in the capital's case file. The Crown Court worked slowly, but the audit office acted swiftly. A month later, the decision arrived. The Felder family's lands were transferred to the creditor's management until the debt was fully settled, and the Baron himself was summoned to the capital. The Aspern Exchange House was listed as the principal creditor, with a claim of 41,000. Chiron entered the Felder estate not with an army, but with a convoy of grain for the starving Felder villages and 12 accountants. A week later, the Baron's peasants were praying for the new administrator. First on the list of debt purchases were now Kroger's securities. He was left without an ally. Baron Kroger would have understood everything sooner than Felder. He did not send soldiers. He did something worse. He went to the Duke. Nayla found out about this a week later at a feast at Ylvis, where Kroger's drunken cousin boasted that the upstart from Aspern would soon be crushed by the real powers that be. And 10 days later, a horseman bearing the pennant of the Duke's house rode into Aspern. He brought neither a threat nor a demand. He brought an invitation, written as politely as a death sentence. Duke Hrothgar summoned Governor Chiron Vale to his residence for the winter hunt, so as to personally meet the man everyone in the district was talking about. According to local custom, refusing such an invitation meant admitting guilt before one's suzerain. Acceptance meant entering a foreign stronghold without one's own 100, because guests were allowed to accompany their suzerain on the hunt with only 2 servants. That evening, the council convened in full. Mirel weighed the risks aloud, and the outlook was grim. Saphira demanded to be taken in place of a servant and sharpened her knife right there in the council. Yvette leafed through the ancestral records, searching for precedents of guests perishing on the Duke's hunts, and found 4. Nayla remained silent out of old habit, then spoke the most important point. At the feast at Ylvis, Kroger's cousin let slip another remark. He said that the Duke was calling on the governor not to kill. The Duke was calling on him to buy. Hrothgar had seen Odo's reports, and Aspern's promissory notes had reached his treasurer. The Duke understood what the barons had failed to grasp. It was more profitable to take such a man for himself than to bury him. Chiron stood by the map and said nothing. The invitation lay on the table and smelled of expensive ink. He thought about how, a year ago, he'd woken up on the floor of this town hall with a scrap of black waxed paper and 9,000 in a chest. Now he had a bank, 100 swords, and 4 women, each of whom was worth an army, and the debts of 2 baronial houses in an iron casket. And all of this could become a noose around his own neck tomorrow if the Duke decided the purchase had been a mistake. He rolled up the map and said he was going. He'd take Nayla and Yvette as his servants. Rumor and law. On the Duke's hunt, the one who counts worst would be the prey. Duke Hrothgar's residence stood on a cliff above the confluence of 2 rivers and was not a castle but a statement of power. Chiron rode up the winding road and did the math. The walls had cost the treasury 300,000 30 years ago. A garrison of 400 spearmen consumed 40,000 a year. The court's upkeep cost another 60. The Duke lived in grand style, and a lifestyle of that magnitude required rivers of gold. These rivers flowed from the district's taxes, and the district had been growing poorer for 10 years in a row. Chiron remembered this thought as one remembers a loaded crossbow on the wall. The master of ceremonies met them and showed them to their quarters. Nayla went down to the lower floors with the servants and disappeared among the staff within an hour. Yvette remained with Chiron as his secretary, and her family name opened doors that no seal could open. That evening, there was a banquet for 100 guests. Chiron sat at the far end of the table, a calculated insult, and ate in silence, a calculated response. Baron Kroger sat closer to the Duke and was beaming. He raised his goblet and loudly proposed a toast to order in the district, where every cricket knows its place. The guests laughed and looked at Chiron. Chiron raised his goblet and replied that he agreed completely,
and that he had just brought the Duke a report on how many stakes in the district had been set and reset. The laughter died down. Duke Hrothgar turned his head toward the far end of the table for the first time. He was in his 50s, gray-haired and gaunt, with the eyes of a moneylender rather than a warrior. He said he'd heard plenty about the governor's love for other people's paperwork. Chiron replied that he loved not the papers themselves, but the order they represented. Hrothgar smiled with just his lips and said they would discuss this while hunting. The hunt began at dawn. The guests were assigned to their quarters, and Chiron was given a room in the farmost enclosure near the ravines. Yvette managed to whisper that 3 out of 4 guest deaths on the Duke's hunts had occurred precisely in those far enclosures. The sense of danger he'd acquired from Saphira remained silent the entire way and didn't speak up until an hour into the chase. A chill ran down his spine on the left. Chiron fell from the saddle a split second before a crossbow bolt pierced the air where his back had been. He tumbled down into the ravine and heard the footsteps of 2 people above him. The baker's extraordinary stamina carried him half a mile along the bottom of the ravine without a break. He saw no more of the archers. Instead, at the mouth of the ravine stood a gamekeeper in the Duke's colors, looking at him without the slightest surprise. The gamekeeper said that the governor had strayed from the hunt and that the Duke was waiting for him at the hunting lodge. Chiron understood everything. This wasn't an assassination attempt. It was both a test and an invitation. Hrothgar was demonstrating how easily those who hadn't made a deal died in his forests. A bonfire was burning at the hunting lodge, and the Duke sat alone, not counting the 20 guards at the edge of the woods. He poured the wine himself and asked without preamble how much the governor wants for Aspern. Chiron replied that Aspern was not his property and therefore was not for sale. Hrothgar nodded like a teacher pleased with a student and clarified his question. How much does the governor want for himself? He continued, speaking calmly yet menacingly. He said he had been watching the accountant from Aspern for half a year, that he himself had been buying up the baron's debts for 20 years and knew the ins and outs of the business, and therefore could spot a stranger's hand from a mile away. That the barons were doomed one way or another, and the only dispute was over who would get the district. He offered Chiron the position of treasurer of the duchy, a 10th share of all future estates, and any of the district's daughters as a wife. In return, Aspern's exchange house would be merged into the Duke's treasury. All purchased promissory notes would be transferred to Hrothgar, and the governor would henceforth manage the district's finances for the Duke rather than for the commoners. Chiron stared into the fire and remained silent for a long time. Then he asked permission to respond with numbers, because words lie, but numbers do not. Hrothgar smiled and gave his permission. Chiron took a stick and drew in the snow. The county's tax revenue had fallen over 10 years from 200,000 to 140. The baron's debts were growing by 8 shares a year. In 5 years, the Duke will inherit a district of paupers and an inventory of decaying estates. In just 1 year, Aspern raised revenue from 0 to 35,000 a month and cut the residents' debts by a quarter. If Aspern is eliminated, the Duke will inherit the same rot, only a year earlier. If Aspern is allowed to live, in 5 years the taxes on that revenue alone will give the Duke more than the entire current purchase of the baron's estates. He looked up and finished speaking. The Duke offers him a position as a servant for a tithe. He offers the Duke a partnership for half the estate. The exchange house is opening a branch in the duchy's capital. Hrothgar is investing his capital and providing protection. He gets the barons not bankrupt, but bought out and still operating, because a dead cow gives no milk. It grew so quiet that you could hear the resin crackling in the fire. Hrothgar stared at the sketch in the snow, and Chiron could see the gears turning behind the money changer's eyes. Then the Duke said something strange. He said that 40 years ago, his father had hanged a man who'd proposed something similar to him, and ever since then, the duchy had been counting money the old way. He asked where the governor was from, because such things weren't taught anywhere in the kingdom. Chiron replied that he was from far away, and that the schools there were closed for good. Rotgar didn't press the matter. He took a stick and wrote his figure on the diagram. Not half, 6/10 to the duke. Chiron wrote below it, half, and the Dornhall vote in the county assembly would support the duke's laws for 5 years. Yvette had already agreed to this on the way there. Rotgar looked at the Dornhall name, and something flickered across his face. The voice he had nurtured for 20 years had come into his hands of its own accord, not as a slave, but as an ally. He threw the rod into the fire and held out his hand. The treaty was drafted over 3 days in the presence of his chancellor and Yvette, who spotted 11 pitfalls in the duke's wording and politely rewrote each one. Over the course of those 3 days, Nayla brought up the most important matters from the lower floors. The servants said that the duke was angry at Kroger because he had come to complain and had lied about the size of his debts, exaggerating them by a factor of 2. They also said that the duke had a third son from a morganatic marriage, one whom the court did not recognize and who served as a low-ranking officer on the southern border, and that the duke was secretly paying off his debts through that very same moneylender. Chiron stored this knowledge in his memory alongside the thought of the expensive walls. On the way back, Yvette asked why he'd given the duke such a large share when he could have bargained for half. Chiron replied that a share on paper and actual power were 2 different things. His people would do the counting. His engraver would handle the seals. All the threads of the transaction would remain in Aspern, while the duke would receive a handsome sum and get used to receiving money without fighting. That habit would become an addiction within a year. Whoever pays the bills is the boss, no matter what the share is called. Yvette looked at him for a long time and said that for 400 years, her family had taught her that power grows from the land and the sword. It seemed they had been wrong all 400 years. Aspern greeted them with the ringing of bells. News of the alliance with the duke had overtaken the caravan. Kroger was the first to learn of it, and that very week he made a desperate move. He announced the engagement of his son to the daughter of Count Ilvis and the merging of the 2 houses' ledgers. Together, they still held 110,000 promissory notes from Aspern, and Kroger began demanding payment from the townspeople with the full force of the law, including the rule of the body. The old rule allowed a debtor to be taken to a workhouse for late payment. Kroger's bailiffs seized 6 townspeople in 3 days, including the old engraver. The town was in an uproar. Saphira begged for one more night. Chiron refused and opened the chest. He had 52,000 promissory notes from the Kroger house, purchased for 16. This wasn't enough to cover the 110,000 in counterclaims. Unlike Felder, Kroger made his payments on his promissory notes regularly, and it was impossible to catch him in default. Chiron pored over the law and Yvette's ancestral memory all night. By morning, he had found it. The rule of the body was reciprocal. An ancient county law had been written back when the nobility, too, sat in pits, and it stated that any holder of a promissory note had the right to demand the debtor's body for service in the event of a default. Any holder. The law was silent on the holder's social class because those who wrote it could not imagine commoners having money. Chiron summoned Morel and ordered her to find, among the purchased securities, at least one active default, even by a single day, even for a copper coin. Morel found one by noon. A promissory note for 700 crowns issued by Kroger to a port supplier 9 years ago, which had been overdue by a week even back then, and had subsequently been backdated in violation of the proper form. According to the letter of the law, the debt was considered active and 9 years past due. With interest, the principal amounted to 2,100, a paltry sum. A sufficient sum. By an ancient rule, the holder of this document could demand the debtor's body as payment. Baron Kroger's body. Chiron did not strike immediately. A legal action against the Baron required impeccable form. Otherwise, the county court would bury the case in legal interpretations. Yvette spent a week preparing the documents. She uncovered 3 precedents dating back 400 years where the body rule had been applied to knights, and one where it had been applied to a baronet. She had the copies certified at the temple and by Master Odo, who now came to Aspern once a month of his own accord, and called it an inspection, though it looked more like a pilgrimage. While Yvette was laying the legal groundwork, Chiron was building a second line of defense. He redeemed the debts of all 6 townspeople who had been taken to Kroger's workhouse. By law, the redemption of a debt freed the person immediately. Kroger's bailiffs refused to release the people, citing the Lord's orders. This was the mistake Chiron had been hoping for. Under county law, detaining a free person after the debt had been repaid was considered abduction, and jurisdiction over the matter no longer lay with the Baron, but with the county assembly. The county assembly met once a quarter, and there were 9 days left until the session. There were 12 votes in the assembly. 7 belonged to the barons, 2 of whom had remained silent since Felder's downfall. The Dornhall vote, the guild's vote, the temple's vote, the crown's vote, represented by Odo, and the duke's vote, which was worth 3. Chiron made the rounds among the vote holders like a merchant making the rounds at a fair. To the guilds, he presented turnover figures and promised promissory note loans at 4 shares instead of 8. He reminded the temple who had bought out Gert's loan without haggling and had donated a wing for travelers to the Aspern infirmary. Yvette spoke to the 2 silent barons in the language of genealogy, and both understood that power now went by a different name. Chiron paid nothing for the duke's vote. He simply sent Hrothgar a copy of the documents detailing Kroger's 9-year default, with a single note attached. Your Grace ordered that she be kept informed of the status of the Baron's debts. Nayla reported that the Duke had laughed out loud while reading, the first time in the servant's memory. The district assembly session opened in the old hall with coats of arms on the walls. Kroger arrived with his son and a hired lawyer from the capital and carried himself like a lord. The first case heard was that of the 6 townspeople. Kroger's lawyer spoke for an hour and eloquently. He buried the essence of his argument in words about age-old traditions and the idea that the rabble with money is a rabble without restraint. Then Yvette stood up. She spoke for 8 minutes. She did not defend Aspern. She read the county law aloud, article by article, and after each one asked the assembly whether they considered the law obsolete. Only the king could repeal an article. To acknowledge that the article was in force, but not for everyone, meant to sign on to a rebellion against the legal will of the crown in the presence of Odo. The chamber was silent. The vote was taken openly. 10-2, they ruled that the townspeople's detention was unlawful and imposed a fine of 5,000 on Kroger. Kroger paid, his face the color of old lime. He thought that was the end of it. Then Chiron rose and asked to speak on a private debt matter. He stated the case dryly. A promissory note, 9 years past due. A reissuance in violation of formal requirements, certified by a deceased notary whose seal had been declared invalid 5 years earlier in another case. The amount, with interest, was 2,100 crowns. He was the holder. He demands enforcement under the rule of the body as written in county law. For a second, the hall didn't understand. Then they understood and gasped. Kroger's lawyer jumped up and shouted that the rule of the body had never, ever been applied to the nobility. Yvette stood up and presented 4 precedents to the assembly. The lawyer shouted that this was ancient history. Odo dryly remarked from his chair that the law is not milk and does not sour with age. Kroger looked at Chiron across the hall, and in his eyes was pure, undiluted understanding. He was not being ruined, he was being humiliated. Publicly, by the very same letter of the law by which he had dragged townspeople to the workhouse. The Duke's voice was the last to be heard. Hrothgar's representative stood and declared that his Grace had reviewed the case and found the claim to be lawful,
reminding the assembly that equality before debt law was the foundation of trust in the county's securities, and that trust in those securities now brought the county more than wars ever had. The assembly upheld the claim. Baron Kroger was required to either pay $2,100 within 3 days or enter the service of the creditor for a term of 1 year. Kroger, of course, paid. It wasn't about the money. The next morning, the entire county capital was repeating a single phrase. The governor, a man of the common people, nearly took the baron on as a footman. The Kroger family's promissory notes lost half their value in a week because the holders realized a simple truth. There are no longer any untouchables. Mirel was now buying them up at 1/5 of their face value. Count Ilvis quietly broke off his children's engagement, citing omens. The house of Kroger was left standing alone. The baron made one last sensible move. He sent to Aspern, not soldiers nor law enforcement, but his treasurer, with an offer to sell the entire Kroger debt portfolio in one go. 110,000 Aspern promissory notes in exchange for 40,000 in gold, and a commitment never to present the Kroger house with securities under the rule of the body. Chiron haggled for 2 days and bought the portfolio for 34,000, payable in installments over a year. The funds came from the turnover and deposits of the Duke's branch, which had opened in the county seat a month earlier and had taken in 80,000 in its first few weeks because depositors liked the word Duke on the sign and Aspern's figures in the reports. On the day of the transaction, Chiron carried an iron chest out to the square and, in full view of the entire town, burned the receipts in a brazier, a list totaling 60,000. These were the debts of those who had already served their term of service or worked off their debt through labor over the past year. The fire devoured the paper, and the people stood in silence. Then the old engraver began to weep and laugh, and the crowd erupted in such a roar that pigeons took flight from every roof in the city. The figure was updated on the board at City Hall. The residents of Aspern still owed 170,000. Of that amount, 110 now lay in Chiron's own chest, and he announced a new rule. Any debtor could pay off their debt to the exchange house at face value, without interest, through labor, service, or talent via the system of their own free will. The line at City Hall stretched a week ahead. The system was now operating every day. Chiron took a little from many. A stonemason's share of visual judgment, an old herbalist's share of memory, a year of service with a fisherman. He had learned not to take away a person's very essence, but to remove only a thin sliver, and the system valued that. With every honest exchange, new options opened up to him. After the 1,000th exchange, the system displayed a line for the first time that hadn't been there before. A cumulative exchange reserve has been accumulated. Investment of the reserve in the city's intangible assets is now available. Chiron asked what that meant. The system responded with an example. The reserve could be invested in the success of the district's harvest, in the sturdiness of the city walls, or in confidence in the city's promissory notes. Chiron pondered that line for a long time. It turned out that the system was capable of transforming individual talents into the attributes of an entire city. He invested his first reserve in confidence in the bills of exchange, and within a month he noticed how merchants from other cities accepted Aspern's paper without counting it or checking the seal. That same spring, 2 pieces of news arrived from afar. The first was brought by Room from the kingdom's capital. At court, people were talking about the Aspern miracle, and the crown treasurer requested all of Odo's reports from the audit office. The second was brought by Nayla from the ducal residence, where she now traveled twice a month for concerts. A war had broken out on the kingdom's southern border with the Sultanate of Jazir. For now, it was far away. For now, it was someone else's problem. But Duke Hrothgar had received an order from the crown to field 1,000 lancers and equip them at his own expense. 1,000 lancers in the field cost 120,000 a year. Nayla heard the Duke's treasurer tell the chancellor that there was no such spare money in the treasury, and that they would have to either sell land, ask the crown for a humiliating deferment, or seek a loan. Chiron listened and looked at the map, where the southern border lay far below, beyond the edge of the district. Where there is war, there are loans. Where there are loans, there is his trade. And right there on the southern border served, as an unnamed officer, the Duke's unacknowledged third son, whose debts Hrothgar had been paying off secretly and with shame. Chiron did not yet know how these three things would come together. He knew only that he himself, and no one else, would be the one to bring them together. The Duke arrived in Aspern alone. Without the retinue expected of his rank, 20 horsemen and a traveling cloak without a coat of arms. The town understood everything from that cloak. A suzerain coming to borrow money does not like trumpets. Chiron accepted him. 20 horsemen and a traveling cloak without a coat of arms. The city understood everything from that cloak. A suzerain coming to borrow money does not like fanfare. Chiron received him in the hall of the exchange house, amid accountants and the clacking of abacus beads, and he did so deliberately. Let the Duke see where what he came for actually comes from. Hrothgar stared at the hall for a long time. Then he said, without preamble, that the crown needed 1,000 copies, but he needed 120,000 a year to maintain them, and that he would not sell the ancestral lands as long as he lived. He asked about the terms of the loan. Chiron replied that there would be no loan. Hrothgar narrowed his eyes. Chiron continued, "A war loan is the worst kind of debt in the world. War will either devour the borrower and the money will be lost, or it will drag on and the interest will eat away at the duchy." He proposed something else. The trading house will take on the supply of 1,000 cavalry units as a contract, provisions, fodder, iron, pay, and supply trains, all according to a fixed budget of 98,000 a year, because the house purchases in bulk via river routes without middlemen or thieving quartermasters. The Duke does not pay with money. The Duke pays with a right. The house receives a 10-year concession for all taxes in the district, with the obligation to remit the current total amount of the levies in full to the Duke's treasury. Anything the house collects in excess due to growth in trade remains with the house. The Duke's chancellor choked and said that this was unheard of. Yvette readily handed him a compilation of 7 precedents for tax concessions in the kingdom's history. The chancellor read and scowled. Hrothgar remained silent and did the math. Chiron could see in the Duke's eyes that he was looking for a catch but couldn't find one, because the catch wasn't in the document. The catch was that in 10 years, the tax collection system would be set up in such a way that without the exchange house, the duchy wouldn't be able to collect even half of what it needed. But that wasn't mentioned in the budget proposal. Hrothgar signed it. The war settled everything for him. Supplies were organized within a month, and for the first time, Chiron made extensive use of the system's reserves. He invested his savings in improving the district's roads, and the supply convoys began arriving without losses, so much so that the old carters crossed themselves in amazement. Morel organized grain procurement across 3 principalities and drove the price down by 1/3. Sapphira took control of the convoy's security and, after a fair trial by the assembly, hanged 2 captured quartermasters, thieves from the old ducal service, at the very first crossroads, which had a magical effect on the supply officers. 1,000 copies of Hrothgar's marched south, clothed, fed, and paid in advance, and this became the talk of the kingdom's capital, for the spears of the neighboring dukes were marching to war hungry and angry. Chiron's eyes also went south with the army. He sent 3 accountants and a dozen of Nayla's men, whom she had trained to listen, along with the supply wagons. Officially, they were keeping track of the supplies. In addition to the inventory, they were carrying a letter. Chiron wrote to an officer on the southern border named Darien Fort. That was the name by which the Duke's unacknowledged son was known in the regiments. The letter was brief. The Aspern exchange house informed the officer that his debts to the moneylender Gross had been bought out by the house and fully settled, and that the exchange house was not requesting any compensation. The documents were attached. A note stated that the house was doing this out of respect for those who serve where it is hard, not where it is visible.
Nayla learned of the reaction a month later. Darien Fort read the letter 3 times, asked who Kyron Vale was, listened to the answer, and uttered a strange phrase. He said that for the first time in 26 years, someone had paid for him without hiding. That day, the system showed Kyron something he hadn't expected. Darien Fort's debt has been settled without any counterdemand. A voluntary gift has been recorded. The exchange reserve has increased many times over. Trust earned without coercion is valued higher than any talent. Kyron reread the lines and realized that the system had just taught him the most valuable currency in this world. The summer brought growth the likes of which Aspern had never seen. The tax buyout paid off, and Kyron's first act was to abolish 17 minor levies that cost more to collect than they brought in. Trade flourished. By fall, tax revenues had risen by a quarter above the previous amount, and the entire quarter remained in the treasury. Aspern's bills of exchange were already in circulation across 3 duchies. A 4th mill and a 2nd shipyard were under construction in the city. Yvette opened an arithmetic school at the exchange house for the children of debtors, and there were 10 applicants for every spot. On the board at City Hall, the debt figure had dropped to 90,000. And then trouble came from the south, but it did not come for Aspern. The Crown's army suffered a defeat at the fortress of Sanjar. Not a rout, but a heavy retreat. The supply trains of 2 duchies were burned. Prices for grain and iron throughout the kingdom shot up like a flame through straw. And the capital's banking houses, sensing blood, did what they always do. They raised the interest rates on the Crown's war loans from 10 parts to 16. The Crown was gasping for breath. A man from the capital arrived in Aspern. He introduced himself as a representative of the Treasury, went by the name of Maître Villon, and had the face of a man accustomed to buying everything he saw. He brought an offer that, in his opinion, could not be refused. A syndicate of the capital's financial houses was offering Aspern's exchange house the opportunity to join the Crown's war loan as a junior partner. The stake was modest. The rate was 16 shares, Crown guarantees. Kyron asked what the guarantees were backed by. Villon smiled and replied that they were backed by future taxes from the southern provinces. Kyron asked what would happen to the taxes from the southern provinces if Jazir took Sanjar. Villon stopped smiling. Kyron declined politely but firmly. As he was leaving, Villon said something by the carriage that Nayla heard and remembered word for word. He told his companion that the provincial upstart didn't understand how business was done, and that the syndicate would explain it to him through the regulator. A month later, a royal decree arrived from the capital regulating the circulation of promissory notes. From then on, any promissory notes other than those issued by licensed firms in the capital would be accepted for payment by government offices only after a 1/5 deduction. A license cost 50,000 and was issued by the chamber where the syndicate's leaders sat. The blow was precisely calculated. Aspern's bills of exchange relied on the fact that they were accepted by everyone, everywhere. Mirel read the decree and said that the syndicate had cut off not just their path, but their very lifeline. Kyron convened the board and was so calm that his composure was frightening. He said that the syndicate had given him a gift. For half a year, he'd been thinking about how to enter the capital and hadn't found a cheap way. Now the capital itself had declared war on him, and there was only one way he could win a war. He opened the chest and took out the documents he'd been collecting all summer through Room and his merchants, the debts of the syndicate's capital houses to one another and to foreign banks. The syndicate waged war with the Crown's money, but lived in debt itself, just like everyone else. This was especially true of the Mercat's house, the head of the syndicate, which had invested more heavily than anyone else in the war bond and was keeping afloat with short-term loans. If Sanjar fell, the Crown's securities would plummet, and the Mercats would have nothing with which to cover their short-term debts.
Chiron placed a second document next to it, a report from the accountants in the south. The army retreated because the supplies had rotted. The regiments supplied by Aspern supply trains were the last to withdraw, in good order and with provisions, and this had already been discussed at headquarters. And the third, a letter that arrived a week ago from the southern border, bearing a simple seal. Officer Darian Fort reported that, following the campaign, he had been promoted to commander of the border fortress of Veld, and that if the House of Aspern ever needed an honest man in the south, the house knew where to find him. Chiron laid out the three papers before him as if they were three cards of the same suit. The syndicate is strong as long as the Crown pays 16 shares and as long as the South holds itself together. He proposed the unthinkable. The Aspern Exchange House is offering the Crown a loan directly, bypassing the syndicate. Not at 16 shares, but at 6. Not with money, which the house doesn't have in such quantities, but with what the house does better than anyone else in the kingdom, supplying the entire Southern Army based on a fixed budget, with payment to be made through the Southern customs duties after the war. A cheap loan and a well-fed army versus an expensive loan and rotten supply trains. Mirel turned pale and said that if Sanjar fell, they would lose everything. Chiron nodded and replied that this was precisely why Sanjar must not fall, and that's why everything the system had stockpiled would be sent south along with the grain. He opened the reserve interface in front of the council, something he had never done before. The reserve stood at a level sufficient for 10 cities. Darian's gift and thousands of honest exchanges had done their part. Chiron hovered his hand over the investment line and spoke aloud. The resilience of the fortress of Veld and good fortune on the southern roads. The proposal to the Crown could not be sent by letter. The letter would be intercepted or buried in the syndicate's offices. Chiron traveled to the capital himself, taking Yvette for her reputation and Nayla for her ears.
Saphira escorted them to the capital's gates with 20 swordsmen and remained outside the walls because armed detachments were forbidden from entering the capital, and Chiron did not want to leave Aspern without her or without himself at the same time. The capital was deafening. 500,000 residents. The spires of the temples were 3 times taller than Aspern's town hall, and on every corner, people were talking about the war and the high cost of living. The price of bread had doubled over the past year. People whispered the names of those to blame, and all the whispers pointed to the syndicate. It was Yvette who paved the way to the crown treasurer. The Dornhall family had been listed in the kingdom's golden book for 400 years, and the chief clerk of the treasury turned out to be the grandson of a man whom Yvette's grandfather had once saved during a war long ago. An audience was granted 6 days later. The crown treasurer, Lord Aston, was elderly, weary, and shrewd. He received them in an office piled high with reports, and his very first words made it clear that he knew more about Aspern than Chiron had expected. He said he had read all of Odo's reports, and that miracles do not happen. What happens is that something has been stolen and has not yet been found. Instead of answering, Chiron placed the supply estimate for the Southern Army in front of him, the complete one, broken down by regiments, stores, and routes, with purchase prices across the 3 principalities and the names of the suppliers. 12 accountants and Morel had spent a month compiling it. Aston read it for an hour, and Chiron watched his expression change. The treasurer knew the true costs of war better than anyone else in the kingdom, and so he saw what not everyone would have seen. The estimate was honest. He had never been presented with estimates like this before. Then Chiron laid out the terms, supplying the entire Southern Army for 2 years based on a fixed budget. Payment after victory would be made through the purchase of 3 Southern customs posts for 15 years. If Sanjar fell and the South was lost, the House would receive nothing. Aston looked up and asked if the governor understood that he was staking his entire fortune on a single fortress. Chiron replied that he understood better than anyone because he had already done so. Aston was silent for a long time. Then he said that it was not he who decided, but the Crown Council, and the council included friends of the syndicate who would scuttle the proposal. Unless, he looked at Yvette, unless the issue was raised by someone who could not be silenced. In addition to the dignitaries, the 12 ancient houses of the Golden Book held the right to a direct vote in the council. The Dornhallas were one of them. That right hadn't been exercised in 80 years. Yvette sat up straight and asked only when the session would be held. The Crown Council convened in 3 days, and Chiron didn't attend because commoners weren't allowed in. He waited in the reception hall for 4 hours, and they were long hours. Then the doors opened. Yvette emerged, as pale as her lace collar, her eyes ablaze. She said that her house's 80 years of silence were over. She presented the proposal to the council, and when the Mercat's protege called it a scheme by provincial money changers, she stood up and asked him how much bread cost in the capital, how much it had cost a year ago, and who had pocketed the difference. She then offered the council a choice between a scheme that fed the army for 6 shares and honesty that starved it for 16. The crowned the bill in its entirety that very same day, with a single amendment by Lord Aston. Oversight of its implementation was entrusted to the Court of Auditors, represented by Maitre Odo. Upon learning of this amendment, Chiron laughed for the first time in a month. The syndicate responded a week later in its own way. First, on the river routes of Asperna, all 3 major grain merchants in the principalities raised their prices at once, and it became clear that they had been bought off or intimidated. Murel shifted her purchases eastward to the steppe trading posts after a week of sleepless nights and half of someone else's talent. Chiron would have returned it to her with interest during those nights if the system knew how to return it. Then, at Room's port office, a warehouse burned down, and evidence of arson led to people whom no one could find. Saphira doubled the guards and, on the 3rd night, caught 2 men with flammable oil right by the walls of the exchange house itself. During interrogation in Odo's presence, both pointed to the middleman, and the middleman pointed to the manager of the Mercat's house. The transcripts were filed in the growing folder. And finally, the syndicate made its masterstroke. The Mercat's house announced that it was accepting deposits at an unprecedented rate of 12 shares per year. Money poured into them from the capital like a river. It was madness for any bank, but Chiron read this move like an open book. The Mercats were vacuuming up the kingdom's cash to squeeze the crown into another loan and, at the same time, bleed dry the deposits of competitors, including the ducal branch of Aspern. The pyramid scheme might have lasted a year or 2 before collapsing on the depositors' heads, but the Mercats only needed a year. Chiron did not try to fight the rate. He announced a simple policy at the capital's branch. The Aspern Exchange guarantees deposits with all its assets, including the personal assets of the board, and publishes its books monthly on the doors of the exchange and in leaflets. Anyone literate can come and check. The rate was 6 shares. For a month, the capital had laughed at the provincials and their 6 shares. Then winter came, and news flew in from the south. Jazir had laid siege to Veld. The fortress, which everyone had considered secondary, turned out to be the key. As long as it held, the Sultanate's army could not bypass Sanjar from the west. The Crown Council met through the night. The Mercat's stakes jumped to 14 shares because the syndicate, too, realized that everything was at stake. Chiron didn't sleep during those weeks. Aspern supply trains were heading south through the winter mountain passes, and the good fortune of the roads, purchased with the reserve, held them as firmly as a hand holds a candle in the wind. Of the 40 supply trains, 39 made it through. The syndicate's quartermasters managed to get less than half of their own convoys through in the same time. And the fortress of Veld stood firm. It stood for a month, then another, and a third. Fort's commandant was doing the impossible. A garrison of 800 men repelled 11 assaults. Darian's letters arrived in Aspern with the supply trains and were as brief as blows. He wrote that the warehouses were full, that the soldiers called the Aspern supply trains bread angels, and that the walls were supposed to have collapsed 3 times from the tunnels, but 3 times the tunnels had collapsed on their own, and he didn't understand why, but he was grateful. Chiron read and remained silent. The system's reserves were melting away like spring ice, but they were doing their job. In the spring, the most important news arrived. The Crown's army, having gathered behind the impregnable veld, struck the flank of the Sultan's army, which was stretched thin beneath the walls, and routed it completely. Jazir requested peace. The capital rang all its bells for 3 days. And on the 4th day, what Chiron had foreseen back in the fall, and for which he had waited like a hunter by a burrow, came to pass. Peace meant the end of war bonds. The end of the 16 shares. The Meerkat's investors went to withdraw their money to invest it in peacetime trade. The pyramid wobbled. The Meerkats delayed payments, first by a day, then by a week. The capital lined up at their doors in a queue 3 streets long, and that queue turned into a crowd, and the crowd into a storm. The Meerkats building collapsed in 9 days, burying the savings of half the capital. The syndicate crumbled in its wake because everyone owed everyone else. And amid this collapse, there stood one building where the line wasn't forming to withdraw money, but to deposit it. The capital branch of Aspern's exchange house, with its laughable 6 shares and books posted on the doors. The people who'd been swindled by everyone were bringing their money to the very ones who, year after year, had shown every last copper coin. Deposits tripled in a month. Lord Aston summoned Chiron and told him bluntly that the Treasury had to clear away the ruins of the syndicate and that the Crown Council was asking Aspern's exchange house to take on the payments to the affected Meerkat depositors from the bankruptcy estate because no one else in the kingdom knew how to count in a way that would be trusted. Chiron agreed and asked only one thing in return: the licenses for those very same houses in the capital. Not to buy them, but to receive them as payment for the work. Aston smirked and said that, after everything that had happened, the governor could have asked for 3 times as much. Chiron replied that he would ask for 3 times as much later. That evening, at the capital's residence, Nayla brought him her latest find. Amid the ruins of the syndicate's papers, the bankruptcy clerks had discovered correspondence between the Meerkats and a man whose name made her ask twice to be sure she'd heard it correctly. The letters spanned 2 years. They discussed bread prices, loan rates, and the decree on promissory notes. And they were signed by the Crown's first minister, Lord Govern. The very same man who presided over the council. The very same man who would be presenting Chiron with the Crown's commendation tomorrow. The very same man above whom only the king stood in the kingdom. Govern's correspondence was part of the bankruptcy estate, and the bankruptcy estate was within Chiron's reach, and therein lay both the strength and the trap. To make the letters public would mean accusing the first minister through the hands of a provincial money changer. Govern had ruled the chancery for 20 years. He would bury the case, launch an investigation into Chiron himself, and find whatever he wanted in Aspern, because those who seek will always find. To remain silent meant to leave a man in power who would come up with a new decree on promissory notes tomorrow. Chiron chose the third option. He ordered the bankruptcy clerks to work slowly and to inventory the Meerkat's papers strictly in the order of the shelves. At that rate, it would take 4 months to reach the shelf containing the correspondence. A 4-month head start. During that time, he had to become someone who wouldn't be pushed aside. He returned to Aspern by summer, and Aspern was unrecognizable. The city had outgrown its walls. The second shipyard was launching barges every week. Yvette's School of Accounting had graduated its first 40 accountants, and the ducal chancellery had requested that a dozen be sent over. On the board at City Hall,
the figure for residents' debts had stood at 0 for the first month. It hadn't been erased. In the evenings, old men would gather around it and stare at it in silence, as one might gaze upon an enemy's grave. Chiron convened the council, spread a map of the kingdom on the table, and spoke for an hour. The message was simple. Aspern had won every war that could be won from the province. From there, the choice was either to expand toward the capital or wait for the capital to come to them, and it would come with a raid. Govern would not forgive the syndicate's defeat. That meant they needed something beyond the minister's reach. They needed status. Since ancient times, the kingdom's laws had included a provision regarding free cities. A city that purchased a charter from the crown received its own court, its own guard, the right to mint coins, and was subject only to the king, bypassing all ministers and dukes. There were 2 free cities in the kingdom, and both had received their charters 300 years ago. The price of the charter was not specified in the law. It merely stated that the king grants it upon the recommendation of the council. Yvette said that the council under Govern would never recommend such a thing. Chiron nodded and replied that, for that reason, it would not be the council selling the charter to the king. The treasury would handle the sale. The kingdom had emerged from the war with a debt of 2 million crowns to foreign banks at an interest rate of 11 parts per hundred. Interest payments consumed 1/5 of the tax revenue. Lord Aston was visibly aging under this burden. Chiron proposed to Aston a deal the treasurer would never have dared to dream of. The exchange house would buy out the crown's entire foreign debt and restructure it at 7 parts with a 20-year repayment plan. The treasury would save 80,000 a year. Payment to the house would not be in cash. Instead, it would be a charter granting Aspern the status of a free city and the right to mint coins. Aston asked where the house had obtained 2 million. Chiron replied that the house did not have 1 million and did not need one. Following the syndicate's collapse, foreign banks are wary of royal securities and will sell the debt at a discount. Morel has been quietly negotiating with 2 banks for half a year through the step trading posts, and the price has settled at 7/10 of face value, 1,400,000. 1/3 will be covered by the firm's deposits and profits. 1/3 will be provided by Duke Hrothgar, to whom Chiron will offer a stake in the mint. The final third will be provided by the Southern Customs offices themselves if the Crown agrees to count their concession fee in advance. Aston listened, shook his head, and said it was madness. He calculated aloud and concluded that the madness amounted to a mere pittance. While Morel and Aston were haggling over the deal of the century, Govern struck first. He was too experienced to wait. In the height of summer, the capital's royal prévôt sealed the capital branch of the exchange house following a tip-off regarding the forgery of auction inventories. The tip-off was illiterate, but 5 of Chiron's accountants were thrown into the prefect's prison and interrogated by men in black without coats of arms. At the same time, in the council, Govern introduced a draft decree banning commoners from owning banking houses with a turnover exceeding a certain limit. The decree was aimed at one person in the kingdom, and everyone knew who it was. Chiron received the news a day before a courier from the capital arrived in Aspern with a summons for Vale, the governor, to appear before the crown court to provide an explanation. The council convened that night. Sapphira said that people could be freed from the capital's prison and that she knew how. Chiron forbade it. Yvette leafed through the laws and said that the crown court presided over by Govern was not a court, but a scaffold. Mirel remained silent, wondering what would happen to the deposits if the head of the house were arrested, and her expression made it clear what the outcome would be. And then Nayla spoke up. She said that everyone was looking in the wrong direction. Govern was powerful as long as the king listened to him. King Edwin IV was 26. He had ascended the throne 3 years earlier as a boy under the old minister, and the capital was abuzz with whispers that the minister was preventing the king from maturing. But Nayla wasn't listening to the capital. She was listening to the servants, and the servants were saying something else. The young king hated being under someone's thumb. After his victory in the south, the young king had tasted his own glory for the first time. And the young king had been angry for a month now because Govern had talked him out of traveling south to the army, citing the dangers, while the army celebrated the victory without the king. Chiron listened, and an old skill from his past life rose within him like a fish from the depths. All his life, he had made his way not through administrators who feared change. He made his way through the owners, to whom change promised everything. The owner of the kingdom was not Govern. Chiron traveled to the capital himself at the court's summons, and, along the way, sent 2 letters. The first was to Lord Aston, with a single request, to arrange for the report on the redemption of the foreign debt to be presented directly to the king, rather than through the minister's office. Aston held the ancient right to report personally to the king on the state of the treasury, but he hadn't exercised it for 10 years so as not to anger Govern. The time had come to anger him. The second letter was sent south to Commandant Veld. Chiron wrote to Darien that the fate of the people who had sent him bread angels was being decided in the capital, and that if the commandant deemed it possible, his word regarding winter supplies, spoken in the right place, would now be worth more than gold. He asked for nothing more. To ask more of an honest man would be to lose him. The Crown Court convened in the Autumn Hall with a full complement of judges. Govern sat above everyone else and presided over the case himself, which was against custom but permissible according to the letter of the law. The charges were read for an hour. Forgery of inventory lists, excessive turnover, a dangerous impact on the treasury. Chiron stood alone before the barrier and answered only with figures, and the charges faltered on those figures because the numbers added up. Then Govern set aside the papers and stated the main reason why the whole affair had been set in motion. He said that the issue was not even about the inventories. The point was that a commoner had concentrated in his hands power equal to that of the crown, and such power in the hands of the common people is rebellion by its very nature, regardless of intent. The hall murmured in agreement. It was a verdict, and a beautiful one at that. And at that moment, the doors to the hall swung open. The master of ceremonies entered, struck his staff, and announced His Majesty King Edwin. The king walked through the silent hall in his field uniform, without a mantle, just as he had been doing ever since his victory in the south. Behind him walked Lord Aston with a folder, and an officer in the plain uniform of a border fortress commandant, bearing the kingdom's now most famous scar across his cheek. Govern rose to meet him and began speaking of honor and the unexpected. The king interrupted him with a raised hand. He said he had heard that a man who had concentrated dangerous power was being tried here. He wished to investigate the matter himself because he had been briefed twice today on this man's power. That morning, the treasurer had shown him how this power could free the kingdom from foreign stranglehold and save the treasury 80,000 a year. And an hour ago, Commandant Velda had told him how this power had fed the fortress throughout the siege while everyone else's supply trains froze on the mountain passes. The king turned to the hall and asked aloud if there was anyone else in the room to whom this power had caused harm, aside from the burned-down syndicate that had been plundering his subjects and his treasury. The hall was silent, so much so that the autumn flies on the windows could be heard. Govern stood very straight and very pale, and Chiron looked at him across the hall and saw a man who had spent 20 years winning in a closed room and had found himself in an open one for the first time. The king said in the silence that he was taking the case out of court for his own consideration, and that he wished to see Governor Vale at his residence the next day with a report on the debt redemption, and also that he was surprised as to why the Prime Minister was so concerned about the danger posed by the banking houses, and whether he had reported anything important to him regarding the review of the Mercat family's documents. Govern's expression did not waver, but Chiron heard, with the hearing he'd bought from Nayla, how his breath caught. The king knew, or suspected, or perhaps Aston had placed more than just the debt report on the table that morning.
Tomorrow promised to settle everything. The audience began in the king's small study with no witnesses present, save for Aston, and that in itself was a statement. Govern had not been summoned. King Edwin listened while standing by the window, interrupting with questions, and the questions were astute. Chiron reported for 2 hours, the debt buyout, annual savings of 80,000, and the scheme involving foreign banks. The charter as payment. When he finished, the king was silent for a long time and then asked something the old ruler would never have asked. He asked why Chiron needed a free city if he was already richer than half the lords. Chiron answered truthfully because his instincts told him he couldn't lie to this man. He said that wealth without status is like meat without bones. It can be taken away by any decree from any minister, and today's court is proof of that. He is not building a treasure chest. He is building a place where the law stands above lineage and money flows freely because it is not afraid. Such a place cannot be held together by the word of yet another royal favorite. It is held together only by a charter bearing the royal seal. The king smiled wryly and said that this was the first time he'd heard a petitioner say, in the king's presence, that he didn't trust the king's favorites. Then he grew serious and said slowly that he would sign the charter and redeem the debt on the treasurer's terms. But the crown would have a condition in return, and it was non-negotiable. The Aspern Exchange House would become the crown's bank. It will manage the royal accounts, collect royal loans, and report directly to the king, bypassing the council. Chiron bowed, and inside he felt a strange sensation, like a man who had gone to buy a house but was offered the keys to the entire street. Later, in the hallway, Aston whispered to him that the boy had grown up in a single autumn and that Govern would never be forgiven for this. Govern it all before anyone else.
He was a veteran of the game and knew how to lose battles without losing the war. A week later, he submitted a request to resign for health reasons, and the king accepted it with honors and a pension. The correspondence with the Mercats was never made public. Chiron himself delivered it to the king in a sealed chest and said that it was up to the crown to decide what to do with the past of its servants. Edwin valued that gesture more than any monetary reward. The casket disappeared into the royal archives, and Govern left for his ancestral estate, taking with him the knowledge that he had been spared by a moneylender from the rabble, and that knowledge was worse than the gallows. The 5 accountants were released with the prefect's apologies. The decree banning banks simply was stillborn in the council. The charter was signed on the day of the winter solstice. Aspern became the free city of Aspern, with its own court, guard, mint, and direct allegiance to the king. The foreign debt was redeemed in 3 months. Mirel squeezed the banks down to 2/3 of face value, and the deal of the century closed for even less than the estimate. The mint was laid in the spring, and Hrothgar took a stake with such delight that he forgot to ask why the school in Yvette was recruiting coiners. A new line appeared on the board at City Hall, which had not been erased. Aspern owes nothing to anyone. Everyone owes Aspern. People read it and laughed, and in that laughter was a sound that Chiron would remember forever. That's how people laugh when the hand that has been squeezing their throats for generations finally loosens its grip. That same spring, what had been bound to happen long ago, and what Chiron had forbidden himself to think about during the war years, finally happened. It started small. Mirel brought him some papers regarding the steppe trading posts to sign. She stood by the desk and suddenly said, without any preamble, that her 5-year exchange partnership had expired a month ago, but she'd only noticed it yesterday because she'd forgotten she was serving. She asked, looking him straight in the eye, what would happen now? Chiron opened the system in front of her. Mirel's exchange term had expired.
Her obligations had been fully fulfilled. Chiron said that she was now a free person and a wealthy woman, and that half of her talent would be returned if she asked, because he'd learned from the system that this was possible with mutual consent. Mirel was silent for a long time. Then she said that her talent should stay where it had taken root. She hadn't come for her talent. For 5 years, she had watched this man buy people and make them freer than they had been before the purchase, and she wanted to know if he ever intended to buy something for himself. Chiron didn't have time to answer because Saphira walked in without knocking. She never knocked, and declared from the doorway that her 3-year contract had also expired last fall, and that she was staying not because of a contract, but of her own free will, and let him just try to object. And if these two intended to settle their differences, let them do so in front of everyone, because the whole house had been placing bets for a long time. That evening, in the council chamber, where for 5 years the fates of cities and crowns had been decided, sat 4 women and 1 former vagabond, and the conversation was not about money. Yvette said, with her usual legal straightforwardness, that their alliance of houses allowed for a broader interpretation than a strictly business one, and that she'd looked into the ancestral archives and there were precedents. Nayla said quietly that she'd spent 6 years mute and had learned to hear what people don't say, and that in this room, 5 people, including herself, weren't all saying the same thing. Chiron looked at them. At the merchant he'd bought for a pittance, who turned out to be worth more than all his treasures. At the warrior who had honed her blades on his advice and covered his back. At the heiress who had given him 400 years of laws and the voice of an ancient clan. At the dancer who had been silent for 6 years and was now speaking the most important words. He spoke the truth, as was his habit. He didn't know how to divide his heart into shares like capital. He knew how to do one thing: give everything and receive everything. If they agreed to live under one roof without keeping score over who came first or who was more important, then he would offer them the one thing he had never run through the system: himself. Without exchange, for free. At that very moment, the system turned itself around, something it had never done before, and displayed a line that took Chiron's breath away. A mutual, voluntary gift from 5 parties has been recorded. The value is incalculable. The exchange reserve has been transformed. The final level has been unlocked. The system did not explain what the final level meant. The wedding took place in the summer, according to the old custom of the free cities, where marriages are solemnized by the city court rather than a church, and the city court of Asperna, in its very first session, ratified the union of one house comprising 5 names. The capital spent a week gossiping about the scandal. Duke Hrothgar sent a silver service as a gift, along with a 1-line note stating that he had always suspected the governor of being the kind of man who would achieve an impossible balance even within his own family. The king issued a decree granting the House of Vale of Asperna its own coat of arms, a set of scales against the backdrop of an open book. Chiron looked at the coat of arms and thought that in his past life he had had neither a family, nor a coat of arms, nor a city. Only the bank accounts of other people's corporations and an empty apartment. He had died there, a pauper with money. Here he had started out as a pauper without money and had become rich in what cannot be minted. And in the fall, a letter arrived that served as a reminder that history doesn't end with weddings. It was from Lord Aston, and his hand trembled noticeably. King Edwin had fallen ill. The physicians spoke of a fever, but Aston wrote plainly that the symptoms were strange and that those at court who had fallen silent under the strong king were stirring once more. The 27-year-old Edwin had no heir. Next in line was his cousin, Prince Albert, a man of little consequence and convenient to all. Behind Albert, the remnants of the old nobility were already rallying, along with the surviving capital moneylenders and all those who dreamed of turning back the clock. And turning back the clock in a kingdom where everything was held together by Aspern's promissory notes meant only one thing. The new king's first decree would be to revoke the charter and tighten his grip on the city. Chiron read the letter in a hall where a coat of arms featuring scales hung on the wall, and he felt the world sway beneath his feet once more. He looked up at the women gathered around the table and said that it seemed they were about to undertake the strangest mission of all: to save the king or to survive the kingdom. They set out for the capital the next day. Chiron took all 4 of them and 30 of Sapphire's blades, because the Free City's charter granted his guards the right to enter the capital, and it was worth exercising that right ostentatiously. Along the way, he laid out the task just as he had once laid out Ledger's. The king's illness had 3 possible causes: natural causes, poison, or both, with natural causes being aided by outside forces. The crown physicians swore allegiance to the council, not to the king, and the council was stirring once again. So the physicians could not be trusted. That meant he needed his own man at the king's bedside and his own informants in the palace. Nayla said she would provide the informants. Half the palace staff consisted of people whose relatives the aspirant offices had bought out of debt over the years, and Nayla knew them by name. Finding her own person at her bedside proved more difficult, and she was aided by a coincidence that Chiron later refused to call a coincidence. The healer, whose gift he had once left entirely to her in exchange for service at the infirmary, had risen over the years to become the head of the Aspirin School of Medicine and was now known as Maestra Olda. Her students were known throughout the 3 duchies because they washed their hands, could do arithmetic, and didn't draw blood for just any reason. Lord Aston had pushed her into the palace by invoking the treasurer's right to care for the king's health as if it were the property of the crown, and this phrasing amused the ailing Edwin to the point of a cough, which was, in itself, a form of treatment. Olda spent 3 days at his bedside and emerged with the look of someone who had found a mistake in someone else's book. She said the fever was real but unnaturally prolonged, that the chambers smelled of swampy dampness, even though the palace stood on a hill, and that she had found the source: candles. The expensive ceremonial candles that burned around the clock in the royal bedchamber were impregnated with an extract of a marsh root, which, according to the books on poisons, was not poisonous, but which prevented the fever from subsiding and clouded the mind when inhaled over a long period. The candles were supplied to the court through the chamberlain, and the chamberlain was Prince Albert's man. Chiron learned this, but did not bring it before the court. He was already a man of learning. An accusation without the king as judge is war, and war is won by those at court, and Albert was at court. Chiron acted differently. The candles were quietly replaced with identical but clean ones. Olda switched her drink. Nayla sat in the palace's shaded gallery to listen, and Sapphira placed the chamberlain and his 3 men under tacit surveillance, because whoever poisons someone and sees that the victim is recovering makes the next move, and that move tends to be hasty. The king began to recover after a week. Another week later, he was back on his feet. And then the chamberlain reacted exactly as Chiron had expected. That night, he sent a servant with an unsigned note, and the servant delivered it not to the city, but to the prince's wing. Sapphira caught both of them in the gallery with the note tucked into her sleeve. The note contained 4 words: funds exhausted, iron needed. That would have been enough for a noose, but once again, Chiron did not take the paper to court. He placed it before the recovered king along with a candle with a wick and Olda's report, and said that the rest was not the money changer's business. The money changer's business was to figure out who was paying. He laid out the 3rd sheet: statements of the chamberlain's accounts, which the Crown Bank now saw through completely. The chamberlain had been spending 3 times his salary for the past 6 years, and the money was funneled through a money-changing shop owned by one of Albert's men. Edwin read in silence, and his young face grew old before his very eyes. Then he said quietly that his uncle must not be touched. Not out of pity, but because half the old nobility stood behind his uncle,
and a public trial would tear apart a kingdom that had only just recovered from the war. He asked for advice, not as a king, but as a man who had had 2 months of his life stolen from him. Chiron replied that there was a way older than the courts. Albert's strength does not lie in himself. Albert's strength lies in those who stand behind him, and those who stand behind him do so not for his sake, but for their own fears and debts. Fears can be dispelled. Debts can be bought. He asked the king for 3 months and complete silence. The work began, the very work that Chiron knew better than anyone in both worlds. Morel and the 12 best accountants turned around the finances of Albert's entire party. 40 houses of the old nobility. Of these, 26 were living in debt to the surviving capital moneylenders at exorbitant interest rates, because after the syndicate's collapse, credit for the nobility had become expensive. The Crown Bank began buying up these debts through 7 front companies, quietly and piecemeal. Meanwhile, Yvette was pursuing another strategy. She traveled among the old families, not with money, but with genealogical records, and spoke to them in a language they understood. She showed them that the New World was not burying them, that free Aspern honored the Golden Book, that the House of Dornhall had risen within it rather than fallen, and that the king needed ancient names for new endeavors. She brought 3 of them into the leadership of the bank's provincial branches, and a rumor spread throughout the capital that the Aspern nobles were not servants but rulers. That rumor was worth an army. By the end of the 2nd month, Chiron held 400,000 in debts owed by the nobility of Alber and kept it quiet. At the end of the 3rd month, he did something that later found its way into the textbooks of 2 professions at once. The Crown Bank announced a great conversion. All families listed in the Golden Book were offered the opportunity to voluntarily consolidate any debts they owed to any creditors into a single loan from the Crown Bank at 4 shares instead of the market rate of 12, with a repayment term of 30 years. There was one condition. The loan was granted on the family's word of honor to the crown, which, under ancient law, meant a personal oath of loyalty to the king in the form of money. The nobility rushed into the conversion like water into a fissure. No rebellion in history had ever withstood 4 parts against 12. Within a month, 40 families, including 26 of the Alber family, had renounced their allegiance to the crown in exchange for gold. To continue standing with the prince against the king now meant for them rebelling against their own creditor, who could demand full payment at any moment. Albert's faction melted away without a single arrest. All that remained was the prince, a mere figure, accompanied by his chamberlain, whom the king quietly sent to serve as commandant of a fortress in the northern marshes, where the air smelled distinctly of dampness. Albert understood everything and requested permission to retire to his country estates for health reasons. Edwin granted his request, and the entire court noted that health had become a surprisingly common reason for resignations in the kingdom. And then the king summoned Chiron, and Chiron would remember that conversation for the rest of his life. Edwin paced the study and spoke without using the royal plural, which was a sign of either the highest trust or the greatest alarm. He said that over the past 3 months, he had seen something his council had failed to see. It was not he who had won the war. It was not he who had crushed the conspiracy. In reality, the kingdom was no longer ruled by the crown or the nobility. It was ruled by a tally. And that tally was kept by a single man. He paused and asked point blank, what would prevent that man from buying the kingdom itself tomorrow? Chiron held his gaze and replied with a question of his own. He asked what the king meant by the kingdom. Land cannot be bought. It is already the king's. People cannot be bought. Slavery is forbidden. Only one thing can be bought: debts, obligations, and fears. And he had already bought them. Everything that could be bought in this kingdom already lies in the ledgers of his bank. And the kingdom hadn't fallen because of this. It had risen. Because he didn't buy to possess. He bought to let go. The hall fell very quiet. Then Edwin laughed with a youthful laugh and said that either he was standing before the greatest liar of the century or a man whom his teachers had deemed impossible, and that he intended to find out in a way from which Chiron would not be able to wriggle out. The kingdom needs a new prime minister. The council will submit 3 names, and the king already knows that all 3 will be nobodies. Therefore, the king will act differently. He is establishing a position that has never existed before, the office of Lord Keeper of the Accounts, the 3rd seal of the kingdom after the king and the chancellor, with the right to veto any decree concerning the treasury, currency, and debts. And he offers it to a man from Aspern. Chiron was silent for a long time. He thought of the town hall with its peeling murals, about the paper with the black seal in the vagrant's hand, about the 4 women waiting for him at home, and about the line in the system regarding the final level which had remained unclear for a year. He said he would accept the seal on one condition. The office would not be inherited or sold, but would be granted upon passing an examination by the Court of Auditors to any native of the kingdom, regardless of social class. The king raised an eyebrow and asked why he would limit his own dynasty. Chiron replied with words that, for some reason, the system had shown him that evening, written in gold font. He said that an irremovable accountant over the course of a generation becomes the same as a governor, only with better books. The Lord Keeper's seal settled into Chiron's hand in the throne room before the entire court, and the golden book creaked but remained silent, because half of its noble families owed money to his bank, and the other half had learned to count in his schools. Aspen walked for a week. The man who had started with a vagrant scrap of paper had risen to 3rd in the kingdom. But Chiron himself celebrated little during those days. He was preoccupied with a line from the system regarding the final level, which, after the seal was accepted, had finally come to life. The system unfurled before him a text longer than any that had come before. The accumulated reserve of voluntary gifts has reached the limit of personal use. The host has access to the final investment. The reserve can be transformed into a property belonging neither to the city nor to a person, but to the law. The host has the right to invest everything accumulated into a single rule that will take effect within the kingdom's borders, just as nature does. Without guards, without courts, without coercion. The rule must be formulated by the bearer independently. Warning: this investment is irreversible. After the investment, the system ceases to function and leaves the bearer forever. Chiron read this at night in his study and reread it until dawn. The system was offering him the chance to become the lawmaker of reality itself and to pay for it with the system. He would retain all his talents, but no more exchanges, no reserves, no line before his eyes that had been his second breath for 7 years. He told no one and carried this within himself for a month, and that month turned out to be such that the decision matured on its own, because the world reminded him what life looks like when others write the rules. News came from across the southern sea about the Sultanate of Jazir. The young Sultan Kamal, son of a broken old man, had carried out reforms in his realm that were frighteningly familiar. A unified treasury, a stable currency, the redemption of peasant debts by the treasury, with debtors being converted into state employees. Room's spies reported that a man from the north had been living at the Sultan's court for 3 years, having bought his freedom by explaining to the Sultan the workings of the Aspirin offices. A fugitive manager from the Merkat's household. Jazir was making his own calculations. Only this calculation treated people like cattle. The redeemed debtors received not freedom, but perpetual servitude to the treasury and a brand. Kamal's army was growing on this like yeast, and the trading posts of the south were already feeling its pressure. At the council, Aston stated plainly that in 10 years the kingdom would face a war not of swords, but of 2 calculations. And he asked the Lord Guardian whose account would prove stronger. Chiron replied briefly at the council that the stronger account would be the one people believed in for free. But he figured out the rest to himself. The rule he would establish had to be such that it could never be turned into either a brand or a noose. Never, by anyone, including himself. He spent a month drafting the wording. The drafts were burned in the fireplace by Yvette and Morel, to whom he had first confided. The lawyer and the merchant tore apart every version from both sides. Any rule about money, Morel would turn into a means of plunder within an hour of discussion. Any rule about freedom, Yvette would turn into a loophole for the powerful within 2. Nayla listened to all the arguments in silence, and one day uttered a single sentence that put everything into perspective. She said that for 6 years she had carried someone else's mark on her voice and knew the essence of bondage. Bondage does not begin where money is taken away. Bondage begins where debt overwhelms a person. Chiron froze. That was it. Not about a coin, not about a wager. It was about time. He had formulated it overnight. No debt within the kingdom's borders is inherited. Every obligation dies with the person who took it on. No deal, oath, or seal can bind the unborn, nor can it outlive the debtor. This rule struck at the very heart of the old world. It did not prohibit wealth or abolish loans. It abolished the eternity of bondage. Aspern had once died not from debts, but because his grandchildren were paying for their grandfathers. Jazir had built his power on enrolling the children of debtors into the treasury. A single rule rendered both models impossible forever. Yvette had been searching for loopholes for a week and found only one. Creditors would start lending less and charging higher rates to the elderly. Morel retorted that people had invented insurance societies for this very purpose, and the Crown Bank would be the first to establish one. The circle was complete. All that remained was to make up his mind. Chiron chose the day himself, the anniversary of the night when a vagabond had won the city in a game of dice. He climbed alone to the top of Aspern's town hall tower, from where, 7 years earlier, he had first looked down at the line outside the debt office. The city lay below, bathed in lights. The shipyards, schools, the mint, the board by City Hall with numbers that no one had erased. He opened the system one last time. The reserve for investment. Everything accumulated over 7 years. Thousands of exchanges. Darian's gift. The mutual gift of the 5 parties, beyond calculation. He entered the rule word for word, and the system asked twice whether the bearer confirmed the irreversibility and the farewell. Chiron looked at the city and confirmed. The world did not tremble or burst into flames. It was simply as if, somewhere very deep down, a key the size of a kingdom had been turned in a lock. The lines before his eyes faded away forever, and it grew quiet as it had not been in 7 years. Chiron stood on the tower, an ordinary man whose borrowed talents had become his own, and wept for the first time in 2 lifetimes, without shame. The rule entered the world as spring does, not by decree, but by nature. The notaries were the first to notice it. Hereditary debt records no longer bore a seal. The ink on any document transferring debt to heirs faded overnight on any parchment in the presence of any witnesses. The churches proclaimed it a miracle. The courts stood in confusion for a month until the Lord Keeper introduced a bill to the council that simply described the new reality, and the king signed it with a phrase that was later carved into the courthouse. To recognize as valid that which is stronger than us. The kingdom spent a year restructuring. Old-school moneylenders either went bankrupt or transformed themselves into insurance companies. Serf villages where families had been bound by records for 100 years were freed in a single generation. Some members of the nobility howled that the order was collapsing, and Yvette, from the rostrum of the county assembly, read aloud to them their own ancestral chronicles, where their forebears had mortgaged their grandchildren, and asked if anyone wished to defend that practice out loud. No one came forward.
And from across the southern sea came what Chiron had foreseen but dared not hope for. The rule knew no boundaries of the kingdom as marked on maps. It held within the kingdom's true borders wherever its coin and promissory notes circulated. And Asperna's coins and bills of exchange were already in circulation everywhere, including the bazaars of Jazeera. The Sultan's treasury discovered that the ledgers of debtors were losing their validity wherever settlements were made using northern currency, and all transactions in southern trade were conducted using it. Kamal's system began to unravel, not because of the army, but because of arithmetic. The young Sultan was clever. A year later, a grand embassy from the south arrived in the kingdom's capital with a proposal for eternal trade peace and a personal request from the Sultan. Kamal asked that the people who had established the northern accounting system be sent to him so he could restructure the southern one before it collapsed on its own. Chiron read this letter in the council and thought that 7 years earlier, to win, he had needed to buy out the city. Now, to defeat the empire, he didn't need to buy anything. A single rule, released into the world for free, turned out to be enough. That evening, at home, Sapphira looked at him and said that he had changed since that night in the tower. "Shh," he replied. "I'm just hearing the world without prompts for the first time. And it turns out the world sounds better this way." The Southern Embassy stayed for a month and took with them 40 graduates of Yvette's school, a treaty of eternal trade peace, and the mistress Olda with her students, because the Sultan had asked for doctors, and Olda had said that illnesses do not ask for allegiance. Chiron watched the departing caravan and realized that he was witnessing a new form of what he had been doing his whole life. Before, he had bought people only to set them free. Now, the kingdom was sending its best people out into the world, and this was an investment more reliable than gold. In 10 years, the entire South would keep its accounts according to northern books, seek treatment according to northern medical manuals, and settle disputes according to the law where debt dies with the debtor. Such conquests require no garrisons. The years following the system's departure proved to be a strange time for Chiron. He expected that without the lines before his eyes, he would grow weaker and make a major mistake. The mistakes never came. Instead, a different understanding took hold. For 7 years, the system had not so much given him strength as taught him to see. Exchange, the value of the voluntary, the cost of coercion. The lessons remained even after the teacher was gone. His gift for calculation, his intuition, his hearing, his memory, and the laws of Yvette hadn't gone anywhere. But on top of them had grown something the system could not provide: 20 years of experience across 2 lifetimes. Affairs took their course, and they were immense. The Crown Bank opened branches in 4 neighboring kingdoms because the kings there saw that their neighbor was paying 7 parts on loans while they were paying 14, and they wanted the same. Each branch brought with it a bill of exchange, a school of arithmetic, and the contagion of rules regarding mortal debts, because settlements in northern paper subjected any land to its authority. The Aspern coin became the measure of weight and honesty from the Western Ocean to the steppe trading posts. Life went on at home as well, and that life was bustling. Mirelle gave birth to her first child the year the system collapsed and named her son Matisse in honor of the baker with whom it all began. Old Matisse wept so hard at the christening in the city court that they had to sober him up with his own wine. Then came their daughter Sapphira, who had been carrying her mother's knives since she was 3, and the twins, Yvette, whose grandmother's golden books recorded in the Dornhall family scrolls with delight because the lineage had continued. Nayla was the last to give birth to a girl with such keen hearing that she'd wake up to a whisper through 2 walls, and Nayla would laugh that the system had left the world but left its imprints behind. Amid all this noise, the diapers and the state seals, Chiron once caught himself having a thought that made him stop in the middle of the hallway. He is happy. Not the way victors are happy, but the way people are happy when everything is in order at home. The trial came from where he least expected it, not from the south, not from the nobility.
It came from the mirror. By the age of 50, Chiron Vale was the third most powerful man in the kingdom, the head of the wealthiest house in both worlds, the husband of 4 wives, and the father of 5 children. And the capital began to say what it always says, that the Lord Guardian is irreplaceable, that the exam for his position is a mere formality, because who could pass the exam better than his students, and the students are loyal to their teacher. That after Edwin, the young crown prince hangs on the Guardian's every word. That the House of Vale is the true dynasty. They spoke without malice, with admiration. And that was worse than malice. Chiron had heard these conversations through Nayla's ears and read about them in reports, and one day during a family dinner, he put down his spoon and said he recognized this tune. That's how all the eternal offices in both of his worlds began, with an irreplaceable person whom everyone trusts. He himself had become the very risk against which the exam rule had been written. Yvette asked what he intended to do. He replied that he would do what he had always done. Let go. He had been preparing for 3 years, and he was not preparing a successor, but rather the impossibility of a successor. The Chamber of Accounts exam was rewritten so that it was administered by a panel selected by lot from 30 cities, and it became easier to fail the custodian's relatives on it than a stranger. The Crown Bank was divided into 5 independent chambers, the Capital, Southern, Maritime, Steppe, and Aspirin chambers, so that no single person would ever again hold the entire account in their own hands. Chiron's wives headed only 2 of the 5, while 3 went to apprentices from among former debtors. The keeper's veto power was curtailed by his own law, from any decree except those concerning coin debasement and hereditary debts, that is, except for the protection of the 2 dice on which everything depended. Aston, already a very old man, read this law and said that for the first time he had seen a ruler who squandered his power on building walls against himself. And then came the day that Chiron had set for himself, his 60th year. He submitted a petition to the king requesting his resignation from the office of Lord Keeper of the Accounts, citing a reason he ordered to be recorded verbatim in the chronicles, because the work is complete. Edwin, the king himself now graying, had been trying to dissuade him for a year, offering titles, and finally asked wearily what the keeper wanted as a parting gift, because the crown could not remain in debt. Chiron replied that the crown would not remain in debt. According to his own rule, a debt dies with the debtor. Therefore, let the crown own nothing at all, but simply grant one request. Let the exam to fill his position take place in his presence. He wants to watch. The exam lasted a week in the old assembly hall. 30 candidates from 8 provinces. The problems were selected by lot by the council. Chiron sat in the back row as a mere spectator and watched as young people of both genders and all social classes tackled the problems he had once solved all by himself. The winner was a 30-year-old woman, the daughter of a coal miner, one of those very people who had been sold off individually at his first auction. His bank had bought the girl, who was 4 years old at the time, along with her mother during its first year of operation. She had grown up at the Yvette school. Her name was Mistress Tarna, and when the council asked her why she needed the kingdom's 3rd seal, she replied with words that brought the old hall to its feet. She said she remembered the price paid in places where few keep the books. Chiron handed her the seal himself, and his hand did not tremble. That evening at home, he told his wives that he was free for the first time since that night when he woke up on the floor of City Hall. Sapphira asked suspiciously what he intended to do with his freedom, because she knew all about his freedoms. Chiron took out a map, but not of the kingdom nor of the south. He had drawn the map himself over the past years, piecing it together bit by bit from reports by room, steppe caravan drivers, and sea captains. Beyond the eastern steppes, beyond the edge of all known roads, lay lands about which nothing was really known except for one thing. Caravan drivers from those parts told stories that there were cities where people were sold for the debts of their ancestors going back 10 generations. Aspern's rule did not extend that far. Northern currency didn't reach that far. Chiron spread the map out on the family table,
and said that his whole life he had been buying bondage in order to pay it off. There was one last place left where his craft was needed. He wasn't calling anyone along because his children had grown up, their affairs were separate, and the journey was long. He was simply letting them know where he was headed. 4 women exchanged glances over the map. Mirel said that steppe trade, incidentally, had not been studied and that this was an oversight. Yvette said that comparative law of the Eastern lands was a gap in her work. Nayla said she had always wanted to hear languages that no one else had heard. Saphira simply went to sharpen her knives. The caravan left Aspern in the spring, and the city saw it off as it had never seen off kings or armies. People stood silently along the road from City Hall to the eastern gates, and then old Mattis, who was in his 90s, brought out bread from the bakery baked in the shape of a set of scales, and the crowd laughed and wept at the same time. Chiron rode along, watching their faces. Half the city was already made up of those who had been born free and had no memory of the lines at the debt office. To them, he was a monument. Monuments must depart in time so as not to become idols. The journey was long. The steppe was measured in months. The caravan was small, 40 people, including Saphira's veteran guards, 3 young accountants from Tarna whom she had sent ahead with orders to write reports, and an old doctor from Olda's school. Along the way, Mirel had casually established a trade route connecting the outposts they passed through, which the steppe dwellers would later call the Silver Trail for 100 years. Yvette recorded the customs of the clans, and by the end of the journey, her scrolls weighed more than the provisions. Nayla learned the steppe language so quickly that the shamans looked askance at her. At 58 years old, Saphira knocked a young Batir from his saddle on a dare, and the Batir's clan immediately offered her the title of honorary mother of the clan, to which she agreed because refusal would mean war. By the fall of the 2nd year, they had reached their destination. The land beyond the edge of the maps was called Keshrim by its people, which meant chain. The name was fitting. 7 fortress cities stood along the Great Eastern River, and each was anchored to the same stone, in an eternal record. The local law stated that debt was sacred and immortal and passed from father to son until full redemption, and redemption was calculated by the priest accountants of the Temple of the Chain, and they calculated it in such a way that the debt grew faster than any life. 1/3 of Keshrim's population was born into the record, lived within the record, and died within the record, passing it on. Those recorded were distinguished by an iron ring around their necks, which they were fitted with at the age of 7. Chiron walked through the market of the first city, watching the people with their rings, and felt the old, cold fury of that first night in the Aspern archives rising within him. He was a stranger here, without the system, without a bank, without the kingdom's seal. Just a caravan of goods, 40 people, and 70 years of experience spanning 2 lifetimes. That was enough. He began as he always did, small and honest. The caravan set up shop in the market square and traded in the unseen, northern steel, glass, and books. They accepted only local currency and kept their prices sky high. Within half a year, Mirel had turned the square into the city's main hub. Then people began buying records. According to local law, anyone could redeem a record from the temple by paying a ransom, but no one did this for strangers, because why would they? Chiron did. He redeemed the records of artisans and gave those he'd redeemed work at the trading yard for a fair wage. And at first, the city laughed at the madman from the west. Chiron's laughter never frightened anyone. Laughter meant that the opponent hadn't yet realized what had begun. A year later, the courtyard ran the best workshop, the best infirmary, where treatment was provided free of charge, and a school where anyone, including the ring-bearers, was taught arithmetic. 2 years later, the number of those redeemed had reached 400, and each worked as people do when they receive pay for the first time. The courtyard grew rich, and the priests of the Temple of the Chain finally stopped laughing and began to calculate. After calculating, they did what they had done for 700 years in the face of any threat. They declared the courtyard a desecrator of the records and roused the city. The mob came to burn down the courtyard at night, torches in hand and led by the priests. And they saw what Keshrim had never seen before. The courtyard had not closed its gates. The gates stood wide open, a light shone through them, and tables stood inside. Seated at the tables were 400 ransomed people with their families, along with all the neighbors whom the courtyard had cared for and taught for 2 years, and the veterans of Saphira, standing not with weapons, but with bread, according to northern custom. Chiron stepped out to face the crowd alone, without guards, just as he had done when he had gone to the bailiffs at the bread shop. He spoke the local language that Nayla had taught him over the past 2 years. He did not curse the temple. He asked the crowd if any of them had checked their own records. At the city gates, he unfurled a giant sheet of paper on which Tarna's accountants had transcribed the temple's open books of atonement. And he revealed to the city a simple truth that the priests had hidden for 700 years behind a veil of sanctity. The interest on the atonement had been calculated incorrectly, not even with malicious intent. It was due to a scribal error from 700 years ago that had inflated the debt by 1 fraction per year, and over the centuries, that fraction had devoured 10 generations. According to Keshrim's own sacred law, an incorrectly calculated entry was considered fully atoned for. Chiron wasn't calling for the temple to be torn down. He was calling for the temple to recalculate. Publicly. In front of everyone. According to its own rules. The crowd that had come to burn stood and stared at the numbers. People with rings around their necks approached the scroll and ran their fingers along the lines of their family lineages. The priests screamed about defilement, but in Keshrim, as everywhere, the numbers proved stronger than the screams because everyone checked them as best they could and everyone's calculations matched. That night, the city did not burn down the courtyard. That night, for the first time in 700 years, the city demanded an accounting from the temple. From there, history took its own course, just as all its stories had. The recount in the first city stripped the rings from 1/3 of those registered immediately. The news traveled down the river faster than the barges. The second and third cities demanded a recount within a month. The young ruler of the fourth city, clever and cruel, summoned Chiron to him in secret and asked what the old man from the west wanted, because no one does such a thing for free. Chiron replied that it did happen and told him about the city of Aspern, about the rule that debt dies with the person, and about how that rule had made the impoverished north richer than the old empires. The ruler listened all night. By morning, he asked what it would take to make that happen in his own land. Chiron laid out on the table what he had carried across the steppe for 2 years, the charter of the exchange house, the curriculum for the school of arithmetic, and a blank sheet of paper for their own rule, which they would have to write themselves because foreign rules do not take root. They spent a year drafting it across all 7 cities amid disputes and a single failed rebellion by the priests, a rebellion quelled not by steel but by a general audit announced by the temple itself to save what remained of the faith. The rule of Keshrim emerged as their own, not that of Aspern. Here, duty did not die with death. Here, duty could not survive 7 years, just as a harvest cannot survive 7 winters. And the rings were melted down into a bell that was hung over the river and rung every time the city's final record was atoned for. The bell rang for 7 years. Chiron was 69 when the 7th city rang out. They stood on the riverbank, the whole family, aged but complete. Mirel counted the barges on the river out of long-standing habit. Yvette was finishing the last scroll of the Eastern Law Code. Nayla listened to the bell and said it had the voice of a free single metal. Saphira grumbled that she had already become an honorary mother of 4 children and that this felt more like captivity than her entire youth. Chiron looked at the river and reflected on the outcome. He had come into this world on the floor of the town hall with a stranger's body and a piece of black wax paper. He was given the system, and for 7 years he believed that the power lay within it. Then she left, and it turned out that the power lay in what she had taught him. Every person has a value. That value is revealed only voluntarily, and everything bought for the sake of possession dies with the owner,
while everything bought for the sake of liberation lives on by itself. He once bought a city, then a county, then the kingdom itself. People said he had bought the kingdom without a single battle, and they were both right and wrong at the same time. He kept nothing for himself from what he had bought. The bank belonged to the 5 chambers. The seal was held by the coal burner's daughter. The rule belonged to all, the born and the unborn. The House of Vale possessed only that which could not be taken away, a name trusted from the western ocean to the eastern river. They walked home unhurriedly along the silver trail, and the news ran ahead of them. At the gates of Aspern, 70-year-old Kyren Vale was met by the city's accountant's grandchildren and an aging king who had arrived without an entourage, as well as the plaque at City Hall that had never been erased in 30 years. That evening, he climbed the City Hall tower alone, just as he had on the night of the final investment. The city glowed with lights below, and somewhere very far to the east, if his heart was to be believed, a bell made of remelted rings was ringing. Kyren stood there and suddenly felt clearly what he had not believed in all these years. A quiet warmth, like a line of text before his eyes. Not the system, just a memory of her, or her last unspent remnant, or simply an old heart. The warmth took shape like words, and the words were these: "The exchange is complete. More has been received than given." That's how only honest deals are closed. Kyren smiled at the city at night. Below, his home awaited him, its windows lit, and 4 women were setting the table for a dinner for 6 because his youngest daughter had arrived with her grandchildren. He descended from the tower and walked toward the light. The richest man of 2 worlds was returning to the place where no one ever owed him anything, and where he was always welcomed without expectation.